In the year 1831, on the southern banks of the Grand River within the vast, windswept expanse of what would later become South Dakota, a Hunkpapa Lakota child was born into a world defined by the relentless cycle of predator and prey. The infant, initially named Jumping Badger, entered existence inside a buffalo hide teepee that smelled of wood smoke, cured leather, and the iron tang of birth. His father, a respected warrior also named Jumping Badger but commonly known as Returns Again, held the slippery, crying newborn and examined the boy's limbs for straightness and strength. The winter winds battered the thick skin of the lodge, whistling through the gaps in the lodge poles, signaling the harsh reality that survival in this territory demanded resilience from the first breath. The child was not born into royalty or guaranteed power. He was born into a nomadic band that moved with the seasons and the herds, where status was earned solely through the demonstration of courage and the ability to provide meat or protection. During his early years, the boy displayed a deliberate, almost unnerving calm that contrasted with the frantic energy of his peers. He earned the childhood nickname Hunkasny, meaning slow, because of the methodical way he observed his surroundings before acting. This was not a slowness of wit, but a calculation of risk and reward. He watched the older men sharpen obsidian and iron arrowheads, observing how they tested the balance of the shafts and the tension of the sinew bowstrings. He studied the women as they butchered carcasses, noting exactly where the knife entered to sever the joints and strip the hide without damaging the meat. The camp was a place of constant industry, filled with the sounds of dogs fighting over scraps, horses whinnying in the rope corrals, and the rhythmic pounding of pemmican. The ground was often muddy or frozen hard as stone, and the air carried the scent of drying meat and burning sage. By the age of 10, Slow was already training for the violence that sustained his people. He practiced with a miniature bow, stalking ground squirrels and prairie dogs in the tall grass. Success was not measured by the beauty of the shot, but by the procurement of food. He learned to endure hunger when the hunts failed and to gorge himself when the kill was fresh, understanding that a full belly was a temporary luxury. His father, Returns Again, began to instruct him in the geography of the land, pointing out the subtle depressions that offered cover during an ambush and the high ridges that served as lookouts. They rode together across the undulating plains, the grass whipping against the boy's legs as his father explained the boundaries of their territory and the constant threat posed by rival tribes like the Crow, the Assiniboine, and the Flathead. These were not abstract enemies, but physical threats that could descend on the camp at dawn to steal horses and take scalps. The training intensified as he approached adolescence. Slow learned to ride bareback, gripping the horse's flanks with his thighs until his muscles burned, becoming one with the animal's erratic movements. He practiced leaning low over the horse's neck to present a smaller target while loosing arrows at a gallop. The physical toll was evident in the bruises and scrapes that covered his body, but complaints were met with silence or derision. Pain was a constant companion on the plains, a sensation to be acknowledged and then ignored. He wrestled with other boys in the dust, the matches continuing until one submitted or was choked into unconsciousness. These brawls were not play. They were rehearsals for hand-to-hand combat where mercy could mean death. The older warriors watched these contests, identifying which boys possessed the killer instinct necessary to protect the tribe. In the year 1845, when Slow was 14 years old, the theoretical lessons of warfare transformed into a bloody reality. A war party was organizing to raid a Crow encampment that had been spotted moving near the Powder River. The Crow were bitter enemies of the Lakota, competing for the same buffalo herds and river valleys. Returns Again prepared his weapons, painting his face with vermilion and black charcoal to signify his intent. Slow, watching the preparations with intense longing, decided he would not be left behind with the women and children. He had no proper war pony of his own, only a gray gelding that was sturdy but lacked the speed of a true charger. He had no gun, only a coup stick, a long, slender rod used to strike an enemy to prove bravery, and a small bow with a few arrows. The war party rode out under the cover of darkness, the hooves of their horses muffled by the soft earth. Slow followed at a distance, keeping silent, his heart hammering against his ribs. The air was cool and crisp, the moonlight casting long, distorted shadows across the ravines. When the sun began to crest over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of violent orange and red, the Lakota warriors spotted a group of Crow riders moving along a ridge. The element of surprise was lost almost immediately as a Crow scout shouted a warning. The silence shattered. The Lakota kicked their horses into a frenzy, screaming war cries that echoed off the canyon walls. The Crow, realizing they were outnumbered, turned their mounts and fled, hoping to reach the safety of the timberline. Slow urged his gray gelding forward, pushing the animal to its absolute limit. The wind tore at his hair and watered his eyes, blurring the rushing landscape. He saw a Crow warrior at the rear of the retreating group, his horse stumbling on the uneven ground. The warrior, painted with yellow stripes across his chest, turned in his saddle and fired an arrow that hissed past Slow's ear. Slow did not flinch. He leaned forward, lashing his horse, closing the distance yard by yard. The older Lakota warriors were shouting, perhaps warning him or cheering him on, but the sounds were drowned out by the roar of blood in his ears. He was focused entirely on the back of the Crow warrior, a man he had never met, whose life he was determined to end. As the gap closed to a few horse lengths, the Crow warrior tried to knock another arrow, but his fingers fumbled in the panic. Slow saw the fear in the man's eyes as he glanced back, a look of realization that he had been caught. Slow did not slow down to shoot. He raised his coup stick, feeling the weight of the wood in his hand. With a guttural scream, he drove his horse directly alongside the enemy. He swung the stick with all his strength, the wood connecting with a sickening crack against the Crow warrior's arm, knocking the bow from his grasp. It was a coup, a strike of bravery, the highest honor a warrior could achieve, but the encounter was not over. The impact destabilized the Crow rider and he slipped sideways. Slow dropped the coup stick and leaped from his own moving horse onto the enemy. The two bodies collided in midair and crashed into the hard-packed dirt, rolling in a tangle of limbs and dust. The breath was knocked out of Slow's lungs, but he scrambled for purchase, his hands finding the Crow's throat. The enemy was strong, thrashing and clawing, his fingernails digging furrows into Slow's face. They grappled in the dirt, the smell of sweat and fear pungent between them. Slow managed to pin the man's arm with his knee, reaching for the knife at his belt. The blade was crude, forged from trade iron, but sharp enough for the task. The Crow warrior bucked, throwing Slow off balance, and for a moment the roles were reversed. The enemy was on top, his hands squeezing Slow's windpipe, cutting off the air. Slow stared up at the sky, seeing the clouds drift indifferently above the struggle. His vision began to darken at the edges. He reached up, gouging at the man's eyes, forcing him to recoil, with a howl of pain. Seizing the opening, Slow drove his knee into the man's groin and rolled him over. He did not hesitate this time. He raised the knife and drove it down. The blade entered the hollow of the neck just above the collarbone. Hot, bright red blood erupted over Slow's hand and forearm. The Crow warrior gurgled, his body convulsing in violent spasms before going limp. Slow remained on top of the corpse for a moment, breathing heavily, his chest heaving. The metallic scent of blood filled his nostrils. He looked at the man he had killed, a warrior with a family, a history, and a name that was now extinguished. There was no remorse, only a profound sense of clarity. He had crossed a threshold. The other Lakota warriors arrived, pulling their horses to a halt around the scene. Returns again looked down at his son, his face impassive but his eyes gleaming with pride. The boy had counted coup and killed an enemy before the older men had even reached the fight. He was covered in dust and blood, his face streaked with gore, but he stood tall. That night back at the camp, the victory was celebrated with drums and songs that lasted until dawn. The women prepared a feast, roasting humps of buffalo meat over the fire. The story of the kill was recounted again and again, the details growing more vivid with each telling. Returns again stood before the gathered band, the firelight flickering on his weathered face. He announced that his son had earned a new name, a name that had come to him in a vision years prior. The boy would no longer be known as Slow. He would take the name Tatanka Iotake, which translated to Buffalo Bull who sits down, or simply Sitting Bull. The name signified a stubborn, immovable power, like a bull buffalo that plants its haunches and refuses to back down from a fight. Sitting Bull accepted the name with solemnity. He understood that it carried a burden. He was now a warrior, expected to defend the people and hunt for the vulnerable. The innocence of childhood, if it ever truly existed, was gone. He began to carry himself with a new authority. He spent hours maintaining his weapons, sharpening the knife that had taken a life, treating it as a sacred object. He sought out the company of the holy men, listening to their stories of the spirit world, believing that his victory was ordained by powers beyond the physical realm. He began to experience vivid dreams, flashes of imagery that he interpreted as messages from the great mystery, Wakantanka. In the months following his first kill, Sitting Bull participated in more raids. The environment of the plains was unforgiving and the competition for resources was fierce. He rode against the Assiniboine in the north, navigating the deep snowdrifts of winter where frostbite claimed toes and fingers as easily as enemy arrows. He learned to track men across the frozen crust, reading the signs of their passage. A broken twig, a pile of horse dung, a disturbed patch of snow. During one skirmish near the Missouri River, he witnessed a fellow warrior take a musket ball to the chest. The man fell from his horse, coughing up pink froth, drowning in his own fluids. Sitting Bull dismounted and dragged the man to cover behind a rock, listening to his dying rasp while returning fire with his bow. The brutality of the death did not frighten him. It hardened him. He saw the effects of intertribal warfare on the non-combatants as well. After a successful raid on a rival camp, the Lakota would return with captured horses and sometimes captives. Women and children who would be assimilated into the tribe to replace those lost to disease or war. Sitting Bull observed the terror in the eyes of the captives, their wails of grief for their slain kin. He did not delight in their suffering, but he accepted it as the way of the world. Strength was the only currency that mattered. If the Lakota were weak, it would be their women weeping and their children taken. This binary worldview solidified in his mind. Protect your own. Destroy the threat. By the time he was 15, Sitting Bull was a full-fledged member of the warrior society. He had participated in the sun dance, a grueling ritual of self-sacrifice where warriors pierced their chests with bone skewers attached to a central pole and danced until the flesh tore loose. The pain was excruciating, a searing fire in the pectoral muscles, but he endured it without crying out, staring into the sun until his vision blurred and he entered a trance state. The scars on his chest became badges of honor, physical proof of his devotion to the people and the spirits. The ritual bonded him to the other men, creating a brotherhood forged in blood and agony. The landscape itself seemed to test them constantly. Summer droughts turned the waterholes into mud pits, forcing the band to travel for days without fresh water. Their lips cracking and tongues swelling, prairie fires started by lightning, or enemy tribes, swept across the grasslands faster than a horse could gallop. Walls of flame consuming everything in their path. Sitting Bull learned to read the wind and the behavior of the animals to predict these disasters. He saw a herd of antelope running nervously hours before the smoke appeared on the horizon, giving the camp enough time to burn a backfire and create a safety zone. Survival required constant vigilance and an intimate connection with the earth. In 1845, the encroaching presence of white traders and trappers was becoming more noticeable, though they were still few in number. They brought metal pots, knives, beads, and the devastating alcohol that rotted the minds of warriors. Sitting Bull regarded these intruders with suspicion. He saw how the trade goods made life easier, but also made the people dependent. He watched as a trader cheated a Lakota man, trading a cheap, rust-pitted musket for a pile of prime beaver pelts. Sitting Bull stepped in, his hand on his knife, his eyes locking with the traders. He did not speak English, but his posture communicated a threat that transcended language. The trader, sensing the violence radiating from the young warrior, nervously added a bag of gunpowder and lead balls to the deal. Sitting Bull watched him leave, spitting on the ground where the man had stood. The year ended with a harsh winter. The snow piled high against the teepees and the temperatures dropped so low that trees exploded from the freezing sap. The buffalo herds moved far to the south, out of reach. The band subsisted on dried meat and bone marrow soup. Hunger was a dull ache in the belly that never went away. Sitting Bull gave his portion of food to the elders and the orphans, going days without eating. He sat by the fire, whittling arrow shafts, his face gaunt but his eyes alert. He listened to the wind howling outside, a sound like the spirits of the dead crying out. He knew that when the spring grass returned, the wars would resume. The crow would return, the horses would be fat, and there would be more blood on the prairie. He was ready. He was Sitting Bull, and his path was paved with the red earth of the battlefield. In the late summer of 1846, the humidity hung heavy over the Yellowstone River Valley, causing the buffalo hide teepees to sweat and the air to thicken with the biting scent of sagebrush and horse manure. Sitting Bull, now a young man fully grown into his frame, sat within the council lodge of the Strong Heart Society, the Kante Tinza. This was an elite warrior fraternity known for its reckless bravery and absolute refusal to retreat in the face of overwhelming odds. The air inside the lodge was opaque with tobacco smoke, and the heat was oppressive, yet no man moved to wipe the sweat from his brow. The induction ceremony was devoid of celebration. It was a grim acceptance of a shortened lifespan. Sitting Bull watched as the sash wearers were chosen. These men carried long strips of red scarlet wool which they would stake to the ground during battle, effectively tethering themselves to one spot. They could not move until a fellow warrior released them or until they died, defending their position. Sitting Bull accepted the obligations of the society, understanding that his life was no longer his own, but a tool to be spent for the Hunkpapa people. During the raids of 1847 and 1848, Sitting Bull began to display the tactical ruthlessness that would define his command. He did not merely charge headlong into the fray like the younger, inexperienced bucks. He studied the terrain, noting the defiles where an enemy could be trapped, or the box canyons where there was no escape. On a raid against the Flathead tribe near the Musselshell River, he led a small party through a dense thicket of chokecherry and willow. The branches whipped their faces, leaving stinging welts, but they moved with the silence of ghosts. When they emerged, they were directly behind the Flathead horse herd. The attack was swift and brutal. Sitting Bull drove his lance through the chest of a horse guard before the man could raise his rifle. The sound of the ribcage cracking was audible over the screams of the horses. They drove the herd away, leaving the Flathead warriors on foot, vulnerable and humiliated. By the early 1850s, his reputation had grown to the point where he was considered a Wichasha Wakan, a holy man who could communicate with the unseen powers. This was not a title bestowed lightly. It was earned through visible results. Before a raid, he would isolate himself, fasting for days until his ribs pressed against his skin and his eyes grew hollow. He described visions of inverted soldiers or falling stars, which the tribe interpreted as omens of victory. During a confrontation with a roving band of Crow in the winter of 1853, the snow was waist-deep, crusty and sharp enough to slice the legs of the ponies. The wind howled from the north, bringing temperatures that froze bare skin in minutes. The warriors were hesitant, unable to see through the blinding whiteout. Sitting Bull rode to the front, his face covered in frost, and pointed a mittened hand toward a vague shape in the distance. He led them directly into the flank of the Crow hunting party. The skirmish was fought at close range with knives and clubs, the snow turning pink and then deep crimson as bodies fell. The heat of the fresh blood steamed in the freezing air. The defining moment of his mercy and his brutality occurred in 1857. The Lakota had engaged a village of Ho, or Assiniboine, near the White Earth River. The Assiniboine were distant relatives of the Sioux but had become bitter enemies. The battle was a chaotic rout. The Lakota warriors, fueled by decades of grievances, swept through the camp, cutting down anyone who stood in their path. Sitting Bull rode his horse through the center of the carnage, his eyes scanning for threats. He saw an Assiniboine family attempting to flee, a man, a woman, and a young boy. The Lakota warriors descended on them. Arrows struck the father and he fell, face first into the dirt. The mother was struck down moments later. The boy, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, stood over their bodies, trembling but holding a small bow. An arrow knocked and aimed at the approaching giants on horseback. The other Lakota warriors raised their guns to obliterate the child. Sitting Bull shouted a command that cut through the noise of the slaughter like a whip crack. He drove his horse between his men and the boy, the animal rearing up, its hooves pawing the air. He announced that the boy was too brave to die and that he would take him as a brother. The other warriors, confused but unwilling to challenge Sitting Bull's authority in the heat of victory, lowered their weapons. Sitting Bull reached down, his hand covered in the grime of battle, and lifted the boy onto his horse. The child was stiff with terror, staring at the man who had just orchestrated the destruction of his world. Sitting Bull named him Stays Back, later known as Jumping Bull or Little, Assiniboine. This act of adoption was not born of softness. It was a strategic calculation of value. Courage was a resource, and he refused to waste it, even if it came from an enemy lineage. Later that same year, the physical cost of his lifestyle was exacted in a violent encounter near the Rainy Buttes. The Hunkpapa had located a large Crow war party, and the fighting was fierce. The terrain was broken, filled with ravines and large boulders that offered cover for snipers. Sitting Bull was on foot, carrying a muzzle-loading trade musket and a shield made from the thick neck hide of a buffalo bull. He advanced on a Crow warrior who was crouched behind a rock outcropping. The enemy fired. The heavy lead ball struck Sitting Bull in the left foot. The impact was catastrophic. The projectile smashed through the metatarsal bones, shredding the tendons and exiting through the sole. The pain was immediate and blinding, a white-hot spike that traveled up his leg and settled in his spine. He collapsed to the ground, the dust gritting against his teeth. He did not scream. He looked at his foot, which was now a mangled ruin of flesh and bone splinters, blood pouring into the dirt. The battle raged around him, the sounds of gunshots and war cries muffling the thudding of his own heart. He dragged himself to cover, trailing a smear of red behind him. He packed the wound with sage and raw earth to staunch the bleeding, binding it with a strip of leather torn from his leggings. He refused to leave the field until the Crow were driven off. The wound would heal, but the bones fused improperly. From that day forward, the great warrior walked with a pronounced limp. The injury served as a constant reminder of his mortality. Every step was a negotiation with pain, a hitch in his gait that distinguished him from the smooth-walking youths. During his recovery, which took the better part of a year, Sitting Bull could not hunt or fight. He sat in the lodge, his foot elevated, watching the seasons change through the smoke hole. This period of enforced stillness deepened his introspection. He spent hours creating pictographs of his exploits, drawing figures on buffalo hides with natural pigments, red ochre for blood, charcoal for horses, yellow clay for the sun. He recorded the 30-plus coups he had counted, the horses he had stolen, and the enemies he had killed. These were not boasts, but a historical record for the tribe. He listened to the elders discuss the changing world. They spoke of the Wasichu, the white men who were appearing in greater numbers along the Holy Road, the Oregon Trail to the south. They brought diseases that turned the bowels to water and covered the skin in pustules. They killed the buffalo not for meat but for tongues and hides, leaving the carcasses to rot and bloat in the sun. By 1859, Sitting Bull was mobile again, though his stride was uneven. His status had risen to that of a tribal leader. He was one of the shirt wearers, a supreme honor that invested him with the responsibility to care for the welfare of the entire nation. This role demanded extreme generosity. When the hunters returned with meat, Sitting Bull ensured the widows and the feeble were fed before he took a bite. When horses were captured, he gave his share away to those who had none. He owned very little in terms of material goods, yet he was the richest man in the tribe because of the influence he wielded. His wealth was measured in the loyalty of the men who rode behind him. In 1860, the pressure from the East began to manifest in direct conflict. The United States government was pushing into the Dakota Territory, surveying land and establishing outposts. Sitting Bull encountered a small group of topographical engineers near the Little Missouri River. They were guarded by soldiers in blue coats with brass buttons. He watched them from a ridge, observing their strange instruments, theodolites, and chains, which they used to measure the earth as if it were a carcass to be butchered. He did not attack immediately. He wanted to understand their purpose. He saw them driving wooden stakes into the ground, marking invisible lines. To Sitting Bull, this was an act of insanity. The land was the mother of all things. One could not own pieces of her any more than one could own the wind or the sunlight. He led a harassment campaign against these intruders. He did not engage in pitched battles against the disciplined volley fire of the soldiers. Instead, he struck at their supply lines. He and his warriors would swoop down on a wagon train, kill the mules, burn the flour, and vanish before the cavalry could mount a pursuit. He targeted the livestock, driving off the beef cattle intended for the forts. He wanted to make the cost of remaining in Sioux territory too high to bear. In one raid, he shot a soldier who was fetching water from a creek. The man fell backward into the water, the current carrying a ribbon of red downstream. Sitting Bull watched the body drift, noting how the heavy wool uniform pulled the man under. These soldiers were slow, loud, and blind to the wilderness, but they possessed a relentless momentum. The winter of 1861 to 1862 was particularly vicious. The snow was so deep that the buffalo were immobilized, trapped in drifts where they starved or were easily picked off by wolves. The Lakota camps suffered. Firewood was scarce and families burned dry dung to keep warm. Sitting Bull sat in council with the other chiefs, Four Horns, Black Moon, and Red Horn. The topic was always the same: the encroachment. Some chiefs argued for accommodation, pointing out the endless supply of goods the whites possessed. Sitting Bull remained adamant. He held up a piece of trade tobacco. "This is good," he said, his voice rasping in the cold air. Then he held up a bullet. "But this is what they bring in the other hand. You cannot take the soft without taking the hard. If we accept their presence, we accept their chains." In the summer of 1862, news arrived from the east that shook the plains. The Santee Sioux in Minnesota, led by Little Crow, had risen up against the settlers and the government agents who had starved them by withholding treaty annuities. The reports were gruesome. Farmhouses burned, families slaughtered in their fields, mass hangings of Sioux warriors. Refugees from the Santee conflict began to trickle into the Hunkpapa camps, their faces gaunt, their eyes haunted by the atrocities they had witnessed and committed. They told stories of how the whites had stolen their land, forcing them onto small plots of dirt where nothing grew, and then refused to give them the food they had been promised. "Let them eat grass," a trader had said, and that trader was found dead with his mouth stuffed full of hay. Sitting Bull listened to these refugees with a stone face. He saw the future in their desperate condition. The Santee had tried to live by the treaty, tried to become farmers, and they had been destroyed for it. This confirmed his deepest suspicions. There could be no peace with a people who did not keep their word. The war that was coming would not be a series of raids for horses or honor. It would be a war of extermination. He looked at the warriors of his camp, men he had known since they were boys playing in the mud. He saw the scars on their bodies and the resolve in their eyes. They would need every ounce of that strength. Late in the year 1862, a confrontation occurred that solidified his total rejection of white negotiation. A steamboat, churning black smoke and sparks, was making its way up the Missouri River. These fire canoes were noisy monsters that scared the game and carried soldiers and supplies deep into the interior. Sitting Bull organized a party to intercept it. They positioned themselves along the riverbank where the channel was narrow and the current swift. As the boat chugged past, struggling against the water, the warriors opened fire. Bullets pinged off the metal smokestacks and shattered the glass of the pilot house. The soldiers on deck returned fire with cannons, the loud booms echoing off the bluffs. Grape shot, canvas bags filled with iron balls, shredded the willows where the warriors were hiding. Sitting Bull stood his ground, firing his trade musket until the barrel was too hot to touch. He saw a man on the deck, an officer, shouting orders. He aimed and fired, but the distance was too great. The boat continued upriver, damaged but unstoppable. It was a machine, indifferent to their anger. Sitting Bull realized then that courage alone would not defeat this enemy. The whites had mechanics and industry on their side. He would need to unite the tribes. The Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, they often fought each other, but the Long Knives were a threat to them all. He began to travel from camp to camp, using his influence as a holy man and a war chief to preach unity. He sat by the fires of rival bands, sharing the pipe, speaking in low, measured tones. He showed them his limp, the scar on his foot. "I have bled," he told them. "I have killed. I have seen the white man's forts. They are like a blight on the grass. They spread and they consume. If we stand apart, we will be broken like dry twigs. If we bundle together, we cannot be snapped." His message resonated with the younger warriors who were eager for a fight, but many of the older chiefs were wary. They remembered the power of the army. Sitting Bull did not berate them. He simply offered his example. He refused all trade goods that he did not capture himself. He wore clothes made only of skins he had hunted. He ate only wild meat. He became a living symbol of the old way, a rebuke to those who were sliding into dependency. One evening, while camped near the confluence of the Yellowstone and the Powder, he went to a lonely hill to pray. He offered tobacco to the four directions. He cried out to Wakantanka for guidance. In the twilight, he saw a vision of a bird, a spotted eagle landing on a staff. The bird spoke to him in a language that was not words but understanding. It told him that his power lay in his refusal to compromise. He was to be the lance tip, the point of resistance. He came down from the hill with a new resolve. The limp in his step was still there, a hitch in his rhythm. But his path was straight. The era of the raids was ending. The era of the wars had begun. The slash of the strong heart was no longer just a wound in his foot. It was the line drawn in the earth, a boundary he would defend until the end of his days. In the early months of 1863, the wind sweeping across the Dakota plains carried the acrid scent of a war that had nothing to do with the Sioux, yet threatened to consume them entirely. While the American states in the East butchered one another over issues of union and slavery, the military apparatus of the United States turned a cold, predatory eye toward the West. Sitting Bull, now 32 years old, felt the tremors of this shift long before the blue columns appeared on the horizon. The refugees from the Santee uprising in Minnesota continued to trickle into the Hunkpapa camps, their bodies emaciated and their spirits broken. They brought tales of General Henry Sibley, a man who hunted Indians with the relentless precision of a wolf pack. But it was not just Sibley. Another commander, General Alfred Sully, was moving up the Missouri River, bringing with him a force designed not for skirmishes but for annihilation. The summer of 1863 passed in a state of high anxiety. The buffalo herds were erratic, disturbed by the increased steamboat traffic and the movement of troops. Sitting Bull kept his band moving, staying away from the river forts, avoiding the trap of dependency. He watched from the high ridges as the soldiers marched. They were different from the traders and trappers of his youth. These men moved in rigid lines, a single organism made of brass buttons and blue wool, commanded by bugle calls that cut through the silence of the prairie. They dragged behind them heavy wagons and, more ominously, cannons, iron monsters that the Lakota called the guns that shoot twice, referring to the initial blast and the subsequent explosion of the shell. In September of 1863, the war arrived in earnest at Whitestone Hill. Sitting Bull was not present at the main engagement, but the aftermath washed over the plains like a bloody tide. Sully's forces had surprised a large encampment of Yanktonai and Hunkpapa, slaughtering warriors, women, and children indiscriminately in the fading light of evening. The survivors who reached Sitting Bull's camp were shell-shocked. They described how the soldiers fired into the teepees, how the cavalry rode down fleeing mothers, and how the captives were chained together like dogs. The most chilling detail was the destruction of the winter meat. The soldiers had piled the dried buffalo jerky and the tanned robes into great mounds and set them on fire, burning the survival of the people while the autumn frost settled on the grass. The winter of 1863 to 1864 was a season of mourning and hardening resolve. The snow piled deep in the coulees and the wind screamed through the smoke flaps of the lodges. Sitting Bull sat in council, listening to the weeping of the widows. He realized that the white man's war was not about counting coup or stealing horses. It was about erasing the Sioux from the earth. They did not just want to defeat the warrior. They wanted to starve the child. The strategy was total. If they could not kill the people, they would kill the food source. This realization settled in Sitting Bull's gut like a stone. He sharpened his knife and checked the priming on his trade musket, knowing that the coming summer would bring a storm of iron. By July of 1864, the tribes had gathered in a massive coalition near the Killdeer Mountains, known to the Lakota as Takahokuti, or the place where they kill the deer. It was a rugged, broken country of deep ravines and high, timbered buttes, a natural fortress that offered water, wood, and shelter. The camp was immense, stretching for miles along the Knife River. There were Hunkpapa, Sans Arc, Blackfoot Sioux, Minneconjou, Yanktonai, and remnants of the Santee. Thousands of lodges dotted the valley, a vibrant city of skin and pole. The air was filled with the sounds of a people at the height of their power, the drumming of warrior societies, the laughter of children playing kickball, the neighing of thousands of ponies. Sitting Bull rode through the camp, his chest swelling with a mixture of pride and dread. He saw the strength of the nation assembled, but he also saw the vulnerability. Such a large gathering required massive amounts of food and grass. It was slow to move. If the soldiers found them here, there would be no easy escape. He urged the camp police, the Akichita, to keep the young men from riding out too far and alerting the enemy. He spent his days in prayer and preparation, painting his warhorse with hailstone markings to make it impervious to bullets. He sensed the approach of General Sully's army before the scouts even brought the word. The earth seemed to vibrate with the heavy tread of the infantry and the rumble of the artillery carriages. On the morning of July 28, 1864, the scouts crested the ridge and signaled the alarm. The Long Knives were coming. They were not a small raiding party. They were a column of over 2,000 soldiers supported by artillery and a long train of supply wagons. The camp erupted into controlled chaos. The women began striking the lodges, frantically packing parfleches with dried meat and loading the travois. The old men herded the children toward the safety of the deep ravines in the badlands behind the mountains. The warriors, stripped to their breechclouts and painted for death, mounted their ponies and rode out to meet the threat. Sitting Bull rode to the front, his face painted with a single stripe of blue lightning. He carried a shield made of thick buffalo hide and a muzzle-loading carbine. He looked out across the rolling prairie and saw the army advancing. It was a terrifying sight. The soldiers formed a hollow square, a massive geometric formation that protected their wagons and livestock in the center. The cavalry protected the flanks and the artillery was positioned at the corners. It was a moving fortress bristling with rifles. The battle began not with a charge, but with a skirmish line. The Sioux warriors, numbering perhaps 1,500, rode in swirling arcs, firing arrows and muskets, trying to find a weak point in the blue wall. They taunted the soldiers, riding close to the lines, hanging off the sides of their horses, but the discipline of the army held. They did not break ranks. Instead, they halted and the front ranks knelt. A ripple of smoke erupted from the square as hundreds of rifles fired in unison. The sound was a continuous tearing crackle. Warriors fell from their horses, the heavy slugs of the Springfield rifles punching through bone and muscle at ranges the Indians could not match. Then came the thunder. The artillery crews swiveled their mountain howitzers and rifled cannons. Sitting Bull watched as a puff of white smoke bloomed from the brass mouth of a gun. A split second later, a shell screamed overhead, landing in a cluster of warriors near a ravine. The earth exploded. Dirt, rocks, and body parts were thrown into the air. The concussion knocked men from their ponies. This was not war as the Sioux knew it. This was impersonal slaughter. The shells did not care about bravery. They tore through the brave and the cowardly alike. Sitting Bull rallied his men, shouting over the roar of the guns, "Be strong! Hoka hey! It is a good day to die!" He led a charge against the left flank of the square, trying to break the infantry line. He rode through a hail of lead, the air buzzing around him. A soldier leveled his rifle at him, but Sitting Bull did not flinch. He fired his carbine, and the soldier crumpled. But for every soldier that fell, 10 more stood in his place, loading and firing with mechanical precision. The volume of fire was overwhelming. The warriors could not get close enough to use their bows effectively. They were being chewed up at a distance. As the afternoon wore on, the heat became oppressive. The dust choked the air, coating the throat and stinging the eyes. The smell of black powder mixed with the copper scent of blood and the bowels of disemboweled horses. The army began to advance, the hollow square moving inexorably forward like a glacier. The artillery continued to pound the ravines where the warriors were taking cover. The exploding shells set the dry grass on fire, adding smoke and panic to the battlefield. Sitting Bull realized that they could not hold the ground. The priority shifted from victory to survival. He turned his horse back toward the village. "Save the women! Save the children!" he shouted. The retreat was a desperate running fight. The warriors fought a rearguard action, stopping to fire from behind rocks and trees, slowing the soldiers down just enough to allow the families to escape into the labyrinth of the Badlands. The scene at the village was one of heartbreak. In their haste, the people were forced to leave behind almost everything. Teepee covers were left on the poles. Tons of dried meat, berries, and tallow, the food meant to sustain them through the winter, were abandoned. Beautifully quill-worked robes, heirlooms, tools, and cooking pots were dropped in the dirt. Sitting Bull watched his own family disappear into the timber, their faces masks of terror. He stayed behind with a core group of warriors holding the high ground, trading shots with the advancing skirmishers. By late afternoon, the soldiers had overrun the camp. From his vantage point on a high butte, Sitting Bull watched the destruction. The soldiers did not just occupy the village, they obliterated it. They set fire to the lodges. The flames leaped high, consuming the work of generations. The stench of burning meat was thick and oily, drifting up the canyon walls. It was a smell that would haunt Sitting Bull for the rest of his life. The smell of his people's sustenance being turned to ash. The soldiers smashed the pottery, broke the lodge poles, and shot the dogs that had been left behind. It was a calculated act of economic warfare. As the sun set, turning the smoke-filled sky a bruised purple, Sitting Bull and the rear guard slipped away into the Badlands. The terrain was a nightmare of twisted rock, deep crevices, and steep clay buttes. There was no water. The horses stumbled on the loose shale, their hooves bleeding. The people were scattered, crying out for lost relatives in the darkness. Sitting Bull rode among them, his voice a calm anchor in the storm. He shared his water skin with a dehydrated child. He helped an old woman onto a travois. He was defeated, but he was not broken. The pursuit did not end at Killdeer Mountain. For days, General Sully chased the Sioux through the Badlands, a landscape the soldiers called hell with the fires put out. The heat was blistering, the thermometer shattering well over 100 degrees. The dust was an alkaline powder that cracked the lips and swelled the tongue. The soldiers, suffering from thirst and exhaustion, were relentless. They fired their cannons into the canyon walls, the echoes rolling like thunder, terrifying the women and children. Sitting Bull orchestrated a series of ambushes to slow the column. At one point, near the Little Missouri River, the soldiers were forced to cross a narrow defile. Sitting Bull placed his best marksman on the rim. As the cavalry entered the trap, the warriors opened fire. A chaotic firefight ensued, the sound of the rifles magnified by the canyon walls. Sitting Bull was in the thick of it, his silhouette visible on the skyline, defying the soldiers to hit him. He saw a bluecoat officer shouting orders, pointing his saber. Sitting Bull aimed his carbine, compensating for the distance and the wind. He squeezed the trigger. The officer's horse reared, struck in the neck, throwing the man to the ground. The column halted, deploying skirmishers to clear the heights. It bought the families another hour of precious time. The trek through the Badlands was a crucible. The weak died. Infants stopped crying and grew cold in their mother's arms. The elderly sat down by the trail, unable to take another step, and waited for the end. Sitting Bull felt every death as a personal failure. He saw the bloated carcasses of horses that had been ridden to death and then eaten raw by the starving people. He saw the look of hopelessness in the eyes of the warriors who had seen their bravery shattered by the impersonal power of the cannon. But amidst the suffering, a new resolve was forged. Sitting Bull gathered the sub-chiefs in a hidden canyon miles ahead of the pursuing army. They sat in a circle, their faces gaunt, their clothes torn. "Look at what they have done," Sitting Bull said, his voice raspy with dust. "They burn our food. They kill our women. They fight with machines because they have no hearts. We cannot fight them as we fought the Crow or the Pawnee. We cannot stand in front of their big guns. We must be like the wolf. We must snap at their heels. We must strike and vanish. We must never let them rest. The Battle of Killdeer Mountain and the subsequent chase through the Badlands marked the end of an era. The illusion that the Sioux could meet the United States Army in open battle and win was shattered by the artillery shells. The romance of the warrior charging across the plain was replaced by the gritty reality of the guerrilla. Sitting Bull understood now that the survival of his people depended on their mobility and their refusal to engage on the enemy's terms. As the army finally turned back, exhausted and running low on supplies, leaving a wake of destruction behind them, Sitting Bull looked back at the smoke rising from the horizon. The loss of the winter stores was a catastrophe that would cause hunger for years. But the people were still alive. The core of the nation had survived the hammer blow. He tightened the cinch on his saddle, checked his weapons, and turned his horse north toward the Yellowstone. The cannon fire had stopped, but the war was far from over. It had just evolved into something darker, colder, and more desperate. The lesson of Killdeer was burned into his mind. The white man brought death not just with the bullet, but with the torch, the wagon, and the survey chain. To survive, the Sioux would have to become harder than the iron that sought to destroy them. On the 9th day of April in the year 1865, a silence fell over the eastern battlefields of Virginia that reverberated violently across the western plains. The American Civil War had ended, releasing a colossal machine of industrial destruction from its fratricidal focus. Sitting Bull, now 34 winters old, stood on a bluff overlooking the muddy Missouri River, watching a steamboat churn upstream against the swollen spring current. The vessel was packed with crates of ammunition and fresh troops, men who had learned the art of killing at places like Shiloh and Gettysburg. The wind whipped his hair across his face, carrying the scent of thawing earth and the metallic tang of the coal smoke belched by the boat. He understood that the real invasion was only just beginning. The soldiers who had been distracted by their own war were now turning their eyes toward the Sioux, bringing with them the railroads, the telegraph wires, and an insatiable hunger for land. The summer of 1865 became a season of relentless, grinding harassment. Sitting Bull recognized that the Sioux could not match the volume of fire he had witnessed at Killdeer Mountain. So he adapted his strategy to one of attrition and terror. He targeted the logistical arteries that kept the forts alive. Near Fort Rice, a lonely outpost garrisoned by volunteer regiments from the territories, Sitting Bull led a small party of Hunkpapa warriors into the dense willow brakes along the river bottom. They waited for the Woodhawks, civilian contractors paid to cut fuel for the steamboats. The axes rang out in the humid air, a rhythmic chopping that masked the sound of the approaching horses. Sitting Bull signaled the attack with a sharp cry. The warriors burst from the cover, riding low. The woodcutters scrambled for their stacked rifles, but they were too slow. Sitting Bull rode down a man in a red flannel shirt, swinging his heavy coup stick. The blow struck the man's temple, with a dull thud, dropping him instantly. The other warriors finished the work with knives and clubs. They took the mules, the axes, and the guns, vanishing back into the timber before the fort's cannon could be run out. This was not a war of glory, it was a war of economic strangulation. Sitting Bull forbade his men from engaging in long-range shooting matches with the fort defenders. Instead, they attacked the mail riders. In late June, a rider attempting to carry dispatches from Fort Rice to Fort Berthold was intercepted on the open prairie. Sitting Bull watched from a distance as his lieutenants Gall and Crow King ran the man to ground. The rider's horse stepped in a badger hole, snapping its leg and throwing the man violently into the hard-packed dirt. He rose, dazed, drawing a Navy revolver. The warriors circled him, making him waste his ammunition. When the hammer clicked on an empty chamber, they moved in. They did not kill him quickly. They stripped him of his uniform, leaving him naked under the blistering sun, his body a canvas of bruises and cuts, a warning to any who would carry the white man's paper words across Sioux land. The brutality of the conflict escalated with the temperature. In July of 1865, General Alfred Sully returned, marching his columns back into the territory to punish the tribes. Sitting Bull shadowed the army, keeping his main camp mobile and hidden in the rugged Badlands. He sent out decoys to lure the cavalry into ambushes. At a watering hole near the Heart River, a squad of soldiers dismounted to fill their canteens. The water was brackish and warm. As they knelt in the mud, arrows hissed from the tall grass on the opposite bank. Two soldiers fell face forward into the water, the shafts protruding from their backs. The others returned fire blindly, aiming at the swaying grass, but the Sioux were already gone, slipping away like smoke. Sitting Bull observed these skirmishes with a critical eye, noting that the soldiers were becoming more cautious, more fearful. They no longer rode with the arrogance they had shown the previous year. The winter of 1865 to 1866 was a test of endurance. The snow fell heavy and wet, sealing the lodges in drifts that reached the smoke holes. Food was scarce due to the disruption of the hunting season. Sitting Bull ordered the rationing of the remaining pemmican. He walked through the camp at night, the snow crunching loudly under his moccasins, checking on the families of the warriors who had died. He gave away his own horses to those who needed to buy food from other bands. His generosity was not a softness, it was the glue that held the Hunkpapa together. He spoke to the young men in the council lodge, the firelight casting long shadows on his face. He told them that hunger was a weapon they could master, while the white men in the forts would turn on each other when their bellies were empty. As the spring of 1866 arrived, the political landscape of the plains underwent a seismic shift. The United States government, weary of the expense of the war, sent peace commissioners up the Missouri to negotiate. They brought treaties that promised annuities, farm equipment, and protection in exchange for land cessions and the right-of-way for roads. Many chiefs of the river tribes, the Yanktonai and the Blackfoot Sioux, signed these papers, tired of the constant fighting. Sitting Bull refused to even approach the treaty grounds. He sent a messenger with a bag of dirt. "This is what they want," he told the messenger. "Take it to them. Tell them they can have this dirt in the bag, but the dirt under my feet stays here." His uncompromising stance attracted the attention of the traditionalist factions across the entire Sioux Confederacy. The Oglala, the Minneconjou, the Sans Arc, and the Brûlés began to look north toward the Hunkpapa for leadership. They saw in Sitting Bull a clarity of purpose that the other chiefs lacked. In the summer of 1867, a massive convocation of the tribes was organized near the Grand River. It was a gathering of thousands, the camp stretching for miles, a sea of lodges and pony herds. The air was electric with the potential for violence and the hope of unity. The elders and the headmen of the warrior societies met in a large council lodge constructed specifically for the occasion. The atmosphere was thick with the smoke of kinnikinnick and the gravity of the decision at hand. Four Horns, Sitting Bull's uncle and a visionary leader in his own right, spoke to the assembly. He argued that the old way of loose confederation was no longer sufficient. The white men acted as one body, commanded by one head. The Sioux needed stronger unity to coordinate their resistance. He proposed that his nephew, Tatanka Iotake, be recognized as a principal chief among the Hunkpapa. A role of immense weight, the ceremony of investiture was solemn and heavy, with symbolism. Sitting Bull was seated on a buffalo robe in the center of the lodge. Four Horns approached him carrying a war bonnet of exceptional beauty. The feathers were from the golden eagle, white with black tips, representing the highest virtues of the warrior. As Four Horns placed the bonnet on Sitting Bull's head, he spoke of the burden it carried. "You are now the head," Forehorn said. "You will think for the people. You will feel their pain before they feel it. You will be the first to bleed and the last to eat." Sitting Bull was then presented with a white horse, a symbol of purity and swiftness. He accepted the role not with a smile, but with a gaze of intense, brooding seriousness. He understood that this role made him the focal point of the white man's hatred. He was no longer just a hunk-papa war chief. He was the embodiment of the Indian impediment to civilization. Armed with this new authority, Sitting Bull intensified the war effort. He coordinated with Red Cloud, the Oglala chief who was fighting to close the Bozeman Trail, a wagon road that cut through the Powder River hunting grounds to the gold fields of Montana. While Red Cloud besieged the forts to the south, Sitting Bull focused his fury on the upper Missouri forts, particularly Fort Buford at the confluence of the Yellowstone. He turned the area around the fort into a kill zone. No soldier could leave the gate without risking death. In late 1867, Sitting Bull led a raid on the sawmill at Fort Buford. The soldiers were using the mill to cut lumber for expansion. Sitting Bull and 100 warriors descended on the facility at dawn. They set fire to the freshly cut timber, the flames leaping high into the gray morning sky. The soldiers poured out of the barracks, forming a skirmish line. Sitting Bull rode back and forth in front of them, his horse dancing, his voice booming over the crackle of the rifles. "Come out!" he shouted. "Come out and fight like men!" Mocked their reliance on walls and breastworks. A bullet grazed his horse's flank, making the animal buck, but Sitting Bull brought it under control with his knees, laughing at the near miss. They drove off the cattle herd, leaving the garrison to eat salt pork and hardtack for the winter. The year 1868 brought the culmination of Red Cloud's war. The United States government, unable to secure the Bozeman Trail militarily, conceded defeat. They drafted the Treaty of Fort Laramie, agreeing to abandon the forts and close the road. They recognized the Great Sioux Reservation, a massive tract of land covering the western half of Dakota Territory, including the sacred Black Hills. It was a victory on paper, and Red Cloud signed, believing he had secured the future of his people. Sitting Bull saw the treaty differently. He saw the boundaries drawn on the map as the walls of a prison. He saw the provision for rations as a trap to create dependency. He refused to travel to Fort Laramie. He remained in the unceded territory to the west, the land of the Yellowstone and the Powder Rivers, where the buffaloes still roamed in numbers. When a Jesuit priest, Father Pierre-Jean de Smay, courageously traveled alone into Sitting Bull's camp in June of 1868 to plead for peace, Sitting Bull received him with respect but firmness. The meeting with de Smet was a clash of two powerful faiths. The priest, an old man in a black robe, sat on a buffalo robe in Sitting Bull's lodge. Outside, thousands of warriors painted for war watched with suspicion. De Smet spoke of the inevitability of the white advance and the need for the Sioux to adapt to survive. He spoke of God's will. Sitting Bull listened, smoking his pipe. When the priest finished, Sitting Bull spoke. "Black Robe," he said, "I know you are a good man, but your people are liars. They say one thing and do another. They want us to become farmers, but they take the good land. They want us to be peaceful, but they bring soldiers. I will not sign. I will not sell the land. I will live as my fathers lived, chasing the buffalo." He allowed de Smet to leave unharmed, a testament to his discipline, but he sent no signature back to the generals. By 1869, the separation between the agency Indians and the hostiles had become stark. The agency Indians gathered around the forts and trading posts, living in squalor, waiting for the government beef that was often rotten or non-existent. They were ravaged by diseases, measles, cholera, and smallpox. Sitting Bull's followers, by contrast, were healthy and well-fed, living off the wild game and the clean air of the high plains. but their numbers were smaller compared to the masses submitting to reservation life. The isolation of his position began to harden Sitting Bull's demeanor. He became more ruthless with intruders. In the autumn of 1869, a group of prospectors was found panning for gold in a creek near the Rosebud River. They were violating the very treaty the government had just signed, but no soldiers were there to stop them. Sitting Bull and his warriors found them. There was no parley. The prospectors dropped their pans and reached for their rifles, but they were overwhelmed instantly. The skirmish was a blur of violence, the wet thud of arrows hitting flesh, the scream of a man as a lance pierced his lung. Sitting Bull stood over the bodies as the water in the creek turned pink. He ordered that nothing be taken from them. Their gold dust, their boots, their guns, all were left to rot with the corpses. It was a message that the Sioux did not want their wealth. They wanted their absence. He also had to contend with the internal politics of the coalition. Young warriors eager for trade goods like coffee and sugar sometimes slipped away to the agencies. Sitting Bull had to use the power of the Akichita, the camp police, to maintain order. In one instance, a warrior named Gray Eagle attempted to leave the camp with a pack horse full of hides to trade at Fort Rice. The Akichita, under Sitting Bull's orders, intercepted him. They did not kill him, but they killed his horses and slashed his teepees to ribbons. It was a harsh justice, a reminder that the survival of the tribe depended on total solidarity. If one man traded, it weakened the resolve of all. As the decade drew to a close, the pressure from the east did not abate. It mutated. The talk in the white settlements was now of a Northern Pacific Railroad that would span the continent, cutting directly through the heart of the last hunting grounds. Surveyors began to appear on the fringes of the territory, protected by heavy military escorts. Sitting Bull watched them from the high ridges, his heart heavy with foreboding. He saw the wooden stakes they drove into the ground as daggers aimed at the heart of the earth. In late December of 1869, a blizzard struck the northern plains with ferocious intensity. The temperature plummeted to 40 degrees below zero. The camp was buried in white. Sitting Bull sat in his lodge, the fire crackling, listening to the wind howl. He held his youngest child, a daughter, wrapping her in a fur robe. He looked into the flames and saw the face of the conflict to come. The treaty had failed to bring peace because the white man's hunger was bottomless. The paper words were meaningless. The only truth was the land, and the only way to keep it was to fight until the last arrow was spent. He was the chief, the shield of his people, and he knew that the next 10 years would determine whether the Sioux would survive as a free people or vanish into the reservation dust. He closed his eyes and prayed to Wakantanka for the strength to stand like a stone against the flood. On the 14th day of August in the year 1870, the sun hammered down upon the Yellowstone Valley with a ferocity that turned the clay soil into a cracked mosaic of baking earth. Sitting Bull, now approaching his 40th winter, sat astride a bay stallion on a ridge overlooking the winding river, his eyes fixed on the distant dust cloud that heralded the return of the industrial serpent. The United States government, driven by the insatiable demands of the Northern Pacific Railroad, had authorized a new wave of survey expeditions to carve a path of iron rails directly through the last great hunting grounds of the Sioux. These were not the lonely trappers or traders of the past. They were military-industrial columns protected by infantry and cavalry, carrying theodolites and chains to measure the land for ownership and division. To Sitting Bull, the wooden stakes driven into the prairie grass were not mere markers. They were daggers stabbing into the flesh of the earth, bleeding the life from the buffalo and the people who depended on them. The conflict that unfolded between 1870 and 1874 was a war of movement and harassment, distinct from the static sieges of the earlier years. The railroad backers in the East, men like Jay Cook, demanded progress, but Sitting Bull ensured that every mile of surveyed track was purchased with blood and terror. He did not possess the manpower to confront the full might of the United States Army in a single decisive field battle, so he utilized the vast, broken terrain of the Yellowstone Basin to his advantage. He transformed the landscape itself into a weapon. His warriors burned the prairie grass for miles ahead of the survey columns, leaving the soldiers' horses and the surveyors' mules with nothing to eat but the scorched earth and the bark of cottonwood trees. The animals grew gaunt and weak, slowing the progress of the expedition to a crawl, while the Sioux ponies fed on hidden pockets of grass in the side canyons remained strong and swift. In the summer of 1871, the skirmishes intensified along the Yellowstone River. The survey party, heavily escorted by Major J.N. Whistler, found themselves shadowed day and night by unseen eyes. Sitting Bull directed his warriors to refrain from suicidal charges against the breech-loading Springfield rifles of the infantry. Instead, they struck at the periphery. They targeted the stragglers, the flankers, and the careless. On a humid afternoon in September, a private from the escort ventured too far from the main column to retrieve a stray mule. He entered a thicket of willows near a tributary creek. The silence was broken only by the buzzing of cicadas until a single gunshot cracked through the air. The main column halted and a squad was sent to investigate. They found the private face down in the mud, his skull crushed by a stone club. The mule gone. There were no tracks to follow, only the rustling of the wind in the leaves. It was a psychological war designed to erode the nerve of the intruders, making them fear every shadow and every bend in the river. By 1872, the government escalated its efforts, sending a larger force under Colonel David Stanley and Major Eugene Baker to push the survey through at all costs. This year marked a significant increase in the ferocity of the engagements. On the 14th of August, 1872, near the mouth of Pryor Creek, the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors launched a pre-dawn assault on Baker's camp. The soldiers were sleeping when the first volley of arrows and musket balls tore through the canvas tents. Chaos erupted as men scrambled for their weapons in the darkness, tripping over guy ropes and cursing in panic. Sitting Bull was in the thick of the fight, his voice cutting through the din, directing the fire of his men. The battle raged for hours, the air thick with black powder smoke that stung the eyes and obscured the sun. Casualties mounted on both sides. A soldier taking cover behind a dead horse was struck in the shoulder by a heavy-caliber slug. He screamed as the bone shattered, the impact spinning him around before he collapsed into the dirt, his blood mingling with that of the animal. The Sioux eventually withdrew as the sun climbed higher. But they had made their point. The railroad would not pass without a heavy toll. The winter of 1872 was a time of deep foreboding. The buffalo herds were becoming noticeably thinner, their migration patterns disrupted by the increasing presence of the whites. Sitting Bull spent the long, cold nights in council, warning the other chiefs that the surveyors were merely the vanguard. He held up a handful of cartridges he had picked up from the battlefield at Pryor Creek. "These are the seeds they plant," he told the assembly, the firelight flickering on his scarred face. "If we let them grow, they will choke out the grass and the water. We must stop the iron road, or we will have nowhere left to walk." The climax of the Railroad War arrived in the summer of 1873. This time, the Army sent a massive force, again under Colonel Stanley, but accompanied by the 7th Cavalry, led by Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer. This was the first time Sitting Bull and Custer would operate in the same theater of war, two destinies beginning to spiral toward a violent intersection. The expedition was a sprawling city on the move, consisting of 1,500 soldiers, hundreds of civilian surveyors, and over 200 wagons. It was a display of industrial might intended to cow the tribes into submission. On the 4th of August, 1873, the heat was blistering, the temperature soaring well over 100 degrees. The column was moving along the north bank of the Yellowstone River near the mouth of the Tongue River. Custer, eager for glory and impatient with the slow pace of the wagons, rode ahead with a squadron of 80 troopers. Sitting Bull had been tracking the column for days, watching for just such a mistake. He saw the separation of the cavalry from the main support and seized the opportunity. He deployed 6 young warriors as decoys. They rode openly on the crest of a hill, taunting the soldiers, their ponies dancing against the skyline. Custer, taking the bait, ordered his men to pursue. The decoys fled, leading the bluecoats into a carefully prepared ambush in a cottonwood grove near the riverbank. As the cavalry galloped into the trap, hundreds of Sioux warriors rose from the tall grass and the timber, the air filled with the deafening roar of gunfire. Custer, realizing his error, ordered his men to dismount and form a skirmish line in the timber. The soldiers fought desperately, their carbines growing hot to the touch. Sitting Bull watched from a high bluff, observing the tactical discipline of the 7th Cavalry. He noted how they conserved their ammunition and maintained their defensive perimeter. This was a more dangerous enemy than the volunteer units he had fought in the past. The battle settled into a stalemate as the main column under Stanley began to arrive, their artillery unlimbering to shell the woods. The Sioux, unwilling to face the cannons, melted away into the Badlands, leaving Custer shaken but alive. Later that same day, on the 4th of August, the violence flared again near the mouth of the Tongue River. The engagement was brutal and chaotic. During a skirmish near the river, the regimental veterinary surgeon Dr. John Honsinger and a sutler named Ballerin were separated from the main force while searching for water. They rode unknowingly into a ravine occupied by a waiting war party. There was no time for them to draw their weapons. A warrior named Rain in the Face, who harbored a deep personal grudge against the soldier chiefs, sprang from the brush. He seized the bridle of Honsinger's horse, bringing the animal to a rearing halt. Before the doctor could shout, Rain in the Face drove a heavy revolver into the man's ribs and pulled the trigger. The explosion was muffled by the body, the impact knocking Honsinger out of the saddle. He hit the ground, gasping for air, blood bubbling from his mouth. Ballerin attempted to flee, but he was ridden down and clubbed from his horse. The warriors did not take their scalps, but they left the bodies where they fell, a grim message to the invaders that no rank or profession offered protection in Sioux territory. The Panic of 1873, a financial collapse that began in the East, abruptly halted the construction of the Northern Pacific Railroad. The funding dried up and the surveyors packed their instruments and retreated. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the Sioux had won. The iron rails stopped at Bismarck, hundreds of miles from the hunting grounds. But Sitting Bull knew this was a temporary reprieve. The greed of the white man was not easily extinguished. In 1874, the threat shifted from the railroad to something far more visceral: gold. Rumors had circulated for years that the Black Hills, the Paha Sapa, the sacred center of the Lakota universe, contained rich deposits of the yellow metal. The Treaty of 1868 explicitly forbade white entry into the hills, guaranteeing the land to the Sioux forever. But in a flagrant violation of the treaty, the United States government authorized a reconnaissance mission led by Custer to investigate the rumors. On the 2nd of July, 1874, Custer's expedition departed from Fort Abraham Lincoln. It was an invasion force disguised as a scientific mission. Over 1,000 soldiers, accompanied by geologists, reporters, and photographers, marched south toward the sacred mountains. Sitting Bull watched the long column of dust from a distance, his heart burning with a cold fury. The Black Hills were not merely land. They were the womb of the nation, the place where the spirits resided, where the warriors went to pray and seek visions. To have soldiers tramping through the valleys, their wagons crushing the wildflowers, was a desecration. The expedition entered the hills in late July, moving through a landscape of breathtaking beauty that Custer named Floral Valley. The soldiers, seemingly oblivious to the sacrilege they were committing, decorated their horses with garlands of flowers, and played brass band music that echoed off the granite canyon walls. They carved their names into the ancient rocks and shot the game with wanton abandon. On one occasion, Custer himself shot a grizzly bear, posing proudly with the carcass for a photograph while the Sioux scouts watched from the ridgelines, noting every detail of the defilement. Sitting Bull did not attack the expedition in force. The column was too large, and the terrain of the hills made a large-scale ambush difficult for the scattered bands to organize in time. Instead, he observed, he sent scouts to trail the column, documenting the route they took, the water sources they used, and the defenses they established. He knew that this expedition was a probe, a testing of the waters. If they found what they were looking for, the flood would follow. On the 30th of July, 1874, the inevitable occurred. Two miners attached to the expedition, Horatio Ross and William McKay, were panning the gravel in French Creek. As they swirled the water and sand in the metal pans, a glitter of yellow flakes appeared in the sediment. It was gold. The discovery was small, but the implications were catastrophic. The reporters embedded with the column immediately began scribbling dispatches that would be carried back to the telegraph lines. "Gold in the grassroots," the headlines would scream. "Rich mines in the Black Hills." The news spread across the United States with the speed of a prairie fire. The country was in the grip of an economic depression, and desperate men saw the Black Hills as their salvation. The government made a half-hearted attempt to uphold the treaty, issuing orders for the army to arrest trespassers, but the lure of wealth was too strong. Miners began to pour into the territory, slipping past the patrols or bribing the soldiers. They came in wagons, on horseback, and on foot, carrying picks, shovels, and rifles. They established illegal settlements, digging up the stream beds and cutting down the timber for sluice boxes. Sitting Bull saw the invasion unfold with a grim fatalism. He had predicted this. The treaty was a lie, just as he had said. The white men did not want peace. They wanted everything. He called for a gathering of the tribes. Messengers rode out to the Oglala, the Minneconjou, the Cheyenne, and the Arapaho. "They have come for the heart of the mother," Sitting Bull told the council. "They are digging into her flesh to take the yellow metal. If we do not stop them, we will die. But this time we do not fight for a railroad or a wagon road. We fight for our existence." The winter of 1874 to 1875 was a time of sharpening knives and hardening hearts. The agency chiefs, Red Cloud and Spotted Tail, were pressured by the government to sell the Black Hills. They were taken to Washington, D.C., wined and dined and shown the power of the industrial cities. But Sitting Bull remained in the unceded territory, the symbol of unyielding resistance. He refused to consider selling the hills. "One does not sell the earth upon which the people walk," he said. His stance drew the disaffected warriors from the reservations. Young men who were tired of the starvation rations and the insults of the agents slipped away in the night to join Sitting Bull's camp. The environment of the plains during this period was harsh and unforgiving. The winter winds howled with a vengeance, driving the snow into drifts that buried the ravines. The warriors huddled in their teepees, repairing their weapons by the light of tallow candles. They molded bullets from trade lead and sharpened iron arrowheads until they could shave the hair from an arm. Sitting Bull moved among them, a presence of calm authority. He checked the stores of dried meat, ensuring that the widows and orphans were fed. He knew that the coming summer would bring war on a scale never before seen. The United States government, frustrated by the refusal of the Sioux to sell the hills, was preparing to remove the obstacle by force. In the early months of 1875, the skirmishes began to bleed into a general state of war. Small groups of miners, emboldened by their numbers, fired on Indian hunting parties. The Sioux retaliated with swift, lethal raids. Near the Cheyenne River, a group of 3 prospectors was ambushed while panning a creek. The warriors, painted black for war, descended on them from the bluffs. The miners fired their Winchester rifles, but they were quickly overrun. The struggle was hand-to-hand, a gritty brawl in the freezing mud. One miner was dragged into the water and drowned, his lungs filling with the icy silt. The others were struck down with war clubs. The warriors took their weapons and their horses, leaving the bodies to be claimed by the wolves. Sitting Bull viewed these encounters not as crimes, but as the necessary defense of a sovereign nation. He was the chief, and his duty was to protect the land. The invasion of the Black Hills was an act of war initiated by the United States, and he would meet it with war. He looked at the growing camp around him, a coalition of tribes united by a common threat. He saw the resolve in the eyes of the men and the fear in the eyes of the women. The gold in the Black Hills had unleashed a demon that would not be satisfied until it had consumed them all. The surveyors had been the scouts, the miners were the scavengers, but the soldiers were the exterminators, and they were coming. The winter of 1875 to 1876 descended upon the northern plains, with a malice that seemed to mirror the political climate in Washington. The wind screamed down from the Canadian Shield, driving temperatures so low that the cottonwood trees along the river bottoms cracked like rifle shots in the night. Inside the buffalo hide lodges of the Hunk Papa, the air was thick with smoke and tension. Sitting Bull, now 45 winters old, sat by the central fire, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. He held a pipestone bowl in his hands, feeling the warmth seep into his calloused fingers. The United States government had issued an ultimatum. All Lakota and Cheyenne Indians living within the unceded territory must report to the agencies by January 31, 1876, or be deemed hostile and subject to military action. The decree was an impossible demand, a death sentence disguised as a bureaucratic order. The deep snow drifts made travel for the women, children, and elderly a suicide mission. And the runners sent to deliver the message often failed to reach the remote camps in the Powder River country. Sitting Bull received the news with a stoic calm that unnerved his subordinates. He knew the ultimatum was merely a pretext for the war the government had desired since the discovery of gold in the Black Hills. He looked at the messenger who had brought the word, a young half-breed shivering in a buffalo robe. "Tell them," Sitting Bull said, his voice low and raspy, "that I am not a white man to be ordered about. I will come when the grass is green and the ponies are fat if I come at all. But I will not drag my people through the snow to starve at their agencies." He understood that the time for evasion was ending. The spring would bring soldiers not to survey or to protect miners, but to kill. As the grip of winter began to loosen in March of 1876, the first blow fell. General George Crook, a man known as the Gray Wolf for his relentless pursuit of the Apache, dispatched Colonel Joseph Reynolds to attack a northern Cheyenne and Oglala village on the Powder River. The morning of March 17th was bitterly cold, the thermometer registering well below zero. The soldiers charged into the sleeping village, firing blindly into the lodges. The Cheyenne, led by Two Moons, and the Oglala, under He Dog, fought a desperate rearguard action to allow their families to escape up the icy bluffs. The soldiers burned the village, destroying the food stores and the winter clothing, but they failed to capture the pony herd. The refugees, half naked and freezing, made their way north to Sitting Bull's camp. When the survivors arrived, their condition was pitiable. Women had wrapped their children in scraps of canvas, their feet frost-bitten and bleeding. Warriors, proud men who had never known defeat, hung their heads in shame. Sitting Bull met them with open arms. He ordered his own people to share their food, their blankets, and their lodges. "Do not be sad," he told the Council of Chiefs. "The soldiers have struck the first blow, but they have only awakened the bear. Now, we are all one people." The attack on the Powder River village galvanized the resistance. Bands that had been wavering, debating whether to go to the agencies, now turned their faces toward Sitting Bull. He became the magnet for every Indian who refused to submit. By May of 1876, the grass on the plains had turned a lush, vibrant green fed by the heavy snowmelt. The ponies grew sleek and strong. Sitting Bull moved his camp slowly, following the buffalo herds that were migrating west toward the Rosebud and Bighorn rivers. The camp grew with every mile. It was no longer just a Hunkpapa band, it was a moving city. There were Minneconjou, Sans Arc, Blackfoot Sioux, Oglala, Brule, Cheyenne, and Arapaho. The column of travelers stretched for miles, a river of humanity flowing across the prairie. The dust kicked up by thousands of horses and travois hung in the air like a localized storm. The United States Army launched a three-pronged invasion designed to entrap this massive gathering. General Crook moved north from Wyoming. General Alfred Terry, accompanied by Custer's 7th Cavalry, marched west from North Dakota, and Colonel John Gibbon pushed east from Montana. It was a mechanical pincer movement, a strategy of total containment. Sitting Bull was aware of the soldiers' movements through his network of scouts. He knew they were coming from all directions like wolves circling a herd. But he did not run. He was confident in the strength of his numbers and the power of his medicine. In early June, the great camp settled in the valley of the Rosebud Creek. The location was idyllic, with ample water, wood, and game. The mood in the camp was one of vibrant defiance. The warrior societies held dances every night, the drums echoing off the bluffs. The young men boasted of the coups they would count, sharpening their knives and painting their shields. Sitting Bull, however, was focused on the spiritual dimension of the coming conflict. He knew that physical strength was useless without spiritual sanction. He announced that he would hold a sun dance, the most sacred ritual of the Lakota people, to pray for the welfare of the nation. The Sundance Lodge was constructed in the center of the camp, a large arbor made of cottonwood poles and leafy branches. The central pole, a tree chosen with great care and treated as a distinguished enemy, was raised with solemn ceremony. On the 14th day of June, 1876, Sitting Bull entered the lodge. He was stripped to the waist, his body painted with white clay. He approached the altar and offered a pipe to the four directions, to the earth and to the sky. Then he sat down against the central pole, his back straight, his legs extended. A trusted assistant, Jumping Bull, knelt beside him, with a sharp awl and a knife. Sitting Bull had pledged a sacrifice of 50 pieces of flesh from each arm, 100 pieces in total. This was an offering of extreme magnitude, a payment of pain to Wakantanka in exchange for insight. Sitting Bull did not flinch as the awl pierced the skin of his forearm. He watched impassively as the skin was lifted and a small, square piece of flesh the size of a match head was sliced away. The blood ran down his arm, dripping onto the sage-covered ground. The process was slow and deliberate. 1 cut, 2 cuts, 3. The pain was a sharp, biting sensation that dulled into a throbbing ache, but Sitting Bull's face remained a mask of concentration. When the 100th piece of skin was removed, his arms were raw and bleeding, covered in crimson streaks. But the ritual was not over. Sitting Bull rose to his feet and began to dance. He stared directly into the sun, which was blazing high in the summer sky. He bobbed up and down on his toes, blowing on an eagle-bone whistle. The piercing shriek of the whistle was the only sound he made. He danced for hours, ignoring the agony in his arms and the exhaustion in his legs. The sun burned into his retinas, turning the world into a blur of white light. Sweat poured down his body, mixing with the blood. The other dancers watched him with awe, drawing strength from his endurance. Sometime during the dance, as the sun began its descent, Sitting Bull entered a trance state. The physical world fell away. The pain vanished. He fainted, collapsing to the ground. The attendants rushed to him, splashing water on his face. When he revived, his eyes were wide and unfocused. He spoke in a whisper, describing what he had seen. He had seen a vision of soldiers falling into the camp upside down, like grasshoppers falling from the sky. They were falling without their ears, a sign that they had not listened to the warnings. He heard a voice say, "I give you these because they have no ears." Daejeon was a prophecy of a great victory, a total annihilation of the enemy. The news of the vision spread through the camp like wildfire. The warriors were electrified. Sitting Bull, the holy man who had never led them astray, had seen the soldiers dying. The fear that had lingered in the back of their minds evaporated, replaced by a grim certainty. They were going to win. The soldiers were coming to die. Just 3 days later, on the 17th of June, the prophecy began to manifest. General Crook's column, consisting of over 1,000 soldiers and hundreds of Crow and Shoshone scouts, was spotted moving down the Rosebud Creek. They were less than 40 miles from the main camp. The scouts rode in, their horses frothing, shouting the alarm. "The Gray Wolf is here. 3 Stars is coming." The camp exploded into activity, but this time the reaction was different. Usually when soldiers approached a village, the priority was to defend the women and children while packing up to flee. This time, the chiefs, Crazy Horse, Gall, and Sitting Bull, decided to take the fight to the enemy. They would not wait to be attacked. They would ride out and meet Crook in the open. Sitting Bull, still weak from his blood loss and the ordeal of the sun dance, could not lead the charge. He rode with the warriors, offering encouragement and spiritual support, but the tactical command fell to the younger war chiefs. Crazy Horse, the Oglala mystic, was in his element. He rode a bay horse, a red-backed hawk skin tied to his hair, a small stone woven behind his ear. He led a force of over 1,000 warriors, Sioux and Cheyenne, up the valley toward the headwaters of the Rosebud. The Battle of the Rosebud was a sprawling, confused engagement, fought over broken terrain of ridges and ravines. Crook had halted his column to rest, his soldiers making coffee, unaware of the storm descending upon them. The Crow and Shoshone scouts were the first to detect the Sioux. They rode frantically back to the main body, screaming that the Lakota were attacking. Moments later, the skyline was filled with warriors. The fighting was fierce and fluid. Unlike previous battles where the Indians would make a few passes and then withdraw, the Sioux and Cheyenne fought with a sustained intensity. They charged the soldier lines repeatedly, using the terrain to mask their movements. They attacked Crook's flanks, forcing him to divide his forces. Crazy Horse seemed to be everywhere at once, rallying the men, shouting, "Come on, Dakotas! It's a good day to fight. It's a good day to die." The battle raged for 6 hours under the blistering sun. The dust was so thick that at times the combatants could only see the muzzle flashes of the rifles. Sitting Bull watched from a high ridge, observing the fulfillment of his vision. He saw soldiers falling, horses screaming, the chaos of war consuming the valley. At one point, a group of soldiers was trapped in a rocky depression. The warriors circled them, pouring in fire. It looked exactly like the grasshoppers falling into the camp. Crook's forces held their ground, thanks largely to the bravery of their Indian scouts and the volume of fire from their breech-loading carbines. But they were mauled. They had expended thousands of rounds of ammunition and suffered significant casualties. More importantly, their confidence was shattered. Crook realized he was facing a force much larger and more aggressive than he had anticipated. As the sun began to set, the Sioux and Cheyenne withdrew, leaving the field to the soldiers. Crook claimed a technical victory because he held the ground at the end of the day. But strategically, it was a defeat. His column was battered, his supplies were low, and his men were spooked. Instead of pressing on to join Terry and Gibbon, Crook turned around and retreated back to his base in Wyoming to lick his wounds. The southern arm of the pincer had been broken. The prophecy had protected the people. Following the battle, the great camp moved west, crossing the divide into the valley of the Little Bighorn River, known to the Lakota as the Greasy Grass. The location was perfect. The river was lined with tall cottonwoods and lush grass for the thousands of ponies. The bluffs on the eastern side offered a natural defensive barrier. The camp spread out along the river for 3 miles, a sprawling metropolis of 5 distinct tribal circles. The Hunkpapa were at the southern end, the place of honor and the first line of defense. Next were the Blackfoot Sioux, then the Sans Arc, the Minneconjou, the Oglala, and finally the Cheyenne at the northern end. The mood in the camp was jubilant but vigilant. They knew that other soldiers were still out there. The victory at the Rosebud had proven their strength, but Sitting Bull warned them not to be complacent. He spent his time in the council lodge discussing strategy with the other leaders. They knew that if the soldiers came again, they would likely attack the village directly. The plan was simple. If attacked, the warriors would swarm the enemy while the non-combatants moved to safety. On the 24th of June, the heat in the valley was oppressive. The air was still and heavy. The women dug turnips in the prairie, the children splashed in the river, and the men tended to the pony herds. Sitting Bull felt a sense of unease. The spirits were restless. He rode through the camp on his gray horse, observing the people. He saw the strength of the nation. Nearly 2,000 warriors, the cream of the plains fighting force. He saw the wealth in the horse herds. He saw the future in the faces of the children. That evening, the scouts reported dust clouds to the east. Soldiers were moving across the divide. It was Custer. The 7th Cavalry had separated from Terry's column and was marching on a forced schedule, eager to claim the glory of the victory before the infantry could arrive. Custer had refused the Gatling guns and the extra troops offered to him, believing that the 7th could handle anything they found. He had no idea of the size of the village waiting for him in the valley. He thought he was chasing a scattering band. He was marching into a hornet's nest. The night of June 24th was restless. The dogs barked incessantly at the moon. The horses whinnied in the darkness. Sitting Bull could not sleep. He sat outside his lodge, smoking his pipe, watching the stars. He thought about the vision of the falling soldiers. It had been partially fulfilled at the Rosebud, but the image of the soldiers falling into the camp suggested a more direct assault. He prayed for the protection of the women and children. He knew that the white men fought without honor, that they would target the helpless to break the warriors. As the sun rose on the morning of June 25, 1876, the camp began to stir. It was a Sunday. The air was already warm, the mist clung to the river bottoms. The daily routine began. Fires were lit, water was fetched, ponies were brought in from the grazing grounds. Sitting Bull was in his lodge, eating a morning meal of meat soup. He was sharing the food with his family, enjoying the quiet moment. Suddenly a cry went up from the southern end of the camp. "Soldiers! Soldiers are charging!" The peace shattered instantly. The thunder of hooves and the crack of carbines erupted. Major Marcus Reno, leading a battalion of the 7th Cavalry, had crossed the river and was charging straight into the Hunkpapa circle. The surprise was total. Bullets ripped through the teepee covers. Women screamed, grabbing their children and running for the river. Sitting Bull dropped his bowl and grabbed his weapons. He ran outside. The scene was chaos. Soldiers in blue shirts were galloping toward the lodges, firing their revolvers. The dust was thick. The Hunkpapa warriors, caught off guard, were scrambling for their mounts. Sitting Bull did not panic. He shouted orders, his voice booming over the din. Mount up, protect the families, do not let them reach the lodges. He saw his own family, his wives and children, fleeing toward the brush. He made sure they were safe, handing his favorite horse to his mother. Take this, he said. Go to the high ground. Then he turned back to the fight. He was too old to lead the charge as a young brave, but he was the spiritual anchor of the defense. He rallied the men, shaming those who hesitated. Are you men? The enemy is here. Fight! The Hunkpapa warriors, led by Gaul, began to form a line of resistance. They poured fire into the advancing troopers. Reno's men, realizing they were charging into a mass of angry warriors that far outnumbered them, halted and dismounted to form a skirmish line. This was the mistake Sitting Bull had foreseen. The momentum of the charge was lost. The warriors began to flank the soldiers, working their way through the brush and the ravines. Sitting Bull watched as the tide turned. The soldiers were confused, their horses rearing in terror. The volume of Indian fire increased as warriors from the other circles, the Oglala, the Minneconjou, rode down to join the fight. The vision was unfolding before his eyes. The soldiers were not conquering, they were falling. They were trapped in the open with the river at their backs and a wall of lead in their faces. But this was only the beginning. As Reno's men broke and fled in a panic back across the river, scrambling up the steep bluffs on the other side, a new threat appeared. To the north across the river, another column of soldiers was seen riding along the ridgelines. It was Custer moving to attack the other end of the village. Sitting Bull looked up at the flags snapping in the wind, the guidons of the 7th Cavalry. He knew that the real battle was about to begin. The prophecy of the inverted soldiers was about to reach its bloody climax on the dusty slopes of the greasy grass. The camp was fully awake now. A dragon roused from its slumber, and it turned its gaze toward the long-haired chief on the hill. On the afternoon of the 25th of June in the year 1876, the sun hung suspended in a cloudless sky, baking the valley of the Little Bighorn River until the air shimmered with heat distortion. The sprawling encampment, which had just repelled the initial assault by Major Reno at the southern end of the valley, now shifted its collective gaze northward like a massive coiled reptile detecting a new vibration. Sitting Bull stood near the center of the Hunkpapa circle, his face streaked with sweat and dust, watching the ridgelines to the east. The chaotic noise of the earlier skirmish, the popping of carbines and the war cries, had settled into a tense, buzzing interlude. Then, the alarm came. Women pointing toward the bluff screamed that more soldiers were coming, riding along the high ground, intent on descending upon the northern flank of the village where the Cheyenne and Minneconjou families were vulnerable. The soldiers were visible as dark silhouettes against the bright sky, moving in a column that stretched along the spine of the hills. It was Lieutenant Colonel George Armstrong Custer and his battalion of the 7th Cavalry. 5 companies strong, seeking a ford to cross the river and crush the village between a hammer and anvil. They had no concept of the magnitude of the force waiting below. Sitting Bull saw the movement and recognized the immediate peril to the women and children who were fleeing north to escape Reno's earlier attack. He did not grab a rifle to join the front lines. His role was the shield, not the spear. He shouted to the people to keep moving, to head for the safety of the broken terrain to the west, away from the river crossings. His voice was steady, anchoring the panic, ensuring that the evacuation remained orderly so the warriors could focus entirely on the killing. Down in the brush along the river, the warriors who had been fighting Reno turned their ponies around. Gaul, the Hunkpapa war chief who had lost 2 wives and 3 children in the opening volley of the first attack, was filled with a cold, black rage. He rallied the men, pointing his hatchet toward the new threat. The warriors stripped off any remaining heavy clothing, riding in breechclouts and moccasins, their bodies painted with yellow and red ochre. They surged across the river at the Medicine Tail Coulee Ford, the water churning white around the legs of thousands of ponies. The sheer volume of the counterattack was staggering. It was not a tactical maneuver. It was a flood of angry humanity fueled by the desecration of their homes. Custer attempted to descend the coulee to reach the river, but he was met by a wall of fire from the far bank. The Sioux and Cheyenne, using the heavy sagebrush and the folds of the earth for cover, poured a relentless hail of arrows and bullets into the approaching column. The soldiers, realizing they could not cross, dismounted to form skirmish lines, but the pressure was too great. They began to fall back, retreating up the long, grassy slope toward the high ridge. This retreat signaled the beginning of the end. The warriors did not stay on the other side of the river. They crossed in droves, flanking the soldiers on both sides, creeping up the ravines that cut into the ridge like open wounds. Sitting Bull remained in the village, watching the distant battle unfold on the heights. He saw the smoke rising in thick, greasy plumes obscuring the sun. He heard the continuous roar of the gunfire, a sound like tearing canvas that never paused. He organized the older men to guard the perimeter of the camp, ensuring that no flanking maneuver by the soldiers would catch the families unaware. His presence was the spiritual battery that charged the warriors on the ridge. They fought with a reckless abandonment of self-preservation because they knew their Sitting Bull had foreseen this. The soldiers were falling. The prophecy was real. On the ridge, the situation for the cavalry deteriorated with terrifying speed. Crazy Horse, leading the Oglala and Cheyenne, had swept around the northern end of the ridge, effectively cutting off any avenue of escape. The soldiers were now surrounded. The geography of the battlefield became a killing box. The soldiers were positioned on exposed ground, silhouetted against the sky, while the warriors filled the depressions and coulees, popping up only to fire and then vanishing back into the grass. The air was filled with the zip of bullets and the wet thwack of arrows striking flesh. The soldiers' horses, maddened by the noise and the pain of wounds, broke their reins and stampeded, depriving the troopers of their reserve ammunition carried in the saddlebags. The heat was a physical weight pressing down on the men in the wool uniforms. Thirst became a torture as intense as the fear. The dust kicked up by the struggle coated the inside of throats and stung eyes. The warriors moved closer, tightening the noose. They used their bows to arc arrows high into the air, creating a plunging fire that dropped deadly shafts onto the soldiers huddled behind dead horses. There was no cover. A soldier would rise to fire his carbine, only to be struck instantly by 3 or 4 bullets from different directions. The impacts were visceral. Skulls shattered, limbs were severed by heavy-caliber buffalo gun slugs, and chests were caved in. One company, led by Captain Keogh, was obliterated in a sudden rush by a wave of warriors led by Gall. The soldiers tried to stand their ground, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer mass of the attack. The fighting devolved into hand-to-hand savagery. Stone clubs crushed collarbones, knives opened throats. The warriors did not take prisoners. The anger over the invasion of the Black Hills, the starvation at the agencies, and the attack on the sleeping families that morning was vented in every blow. A warrior named Low Dog shouted, "This is a good day to die, follow me," and rode his pony directly into the soldier lines, trampling men under his hooves before leaping off to finish them with a knife. As the afternoon wore on, the surviving soldiers were pushed toward a small knoll at the northern end of the ridge. This was the last stand. Roughly 40 or 50 men, including Custer, huddled behind the bloated carcasses of their mounts. They were shooting wildly, their eyes wide with the terror of inevitable death. The warriors crept within 40 yards, taunting them in Sioux and Cheyenne. The end came in a sudden, violent spasm. The warriors rose as one and rushed the hill. The soldiers fired a final ragged volley, but then the wave crashed over them. The final moments were a blur of dust, smoke, and screaming. It was not a heroic tableau. It was a gritty, ugly extermination. Men were clubbed to the ground while trying to reload. Some soldiers, seeing the hopelessness, put their revolvers to their own temples and pulled the triggers to avoid capture. The air smelled of copper blood, voided bowels, and burnt gunpowder. Custer fell early in the final rush, struck by a bullet in the left side of the chest and another in the temple. He collapsed among his men, just another body in the pile. There was no recognition of him in the heat of the moment. He was simply another long knife who had come to kill and had died instead. The silence that followed the last gunshot was heavy and profound. The entire engagement on the ridge had lasted less than an hour. Sitting Bull down in the valley felt the shift in the energy. The roar of battle was replaced by the high-pitched keening of the women beginning the victory songs and the wailing for the Lakota dead. He mounted his horse and rode slowly toward the battlefield. He did not go to gloat. He went to witness. The scene on the ridge was gruesome. The white bodies lay scattered like debris from a storm, stripped of their uniforms. The warriors and women moved among them, reclaiming their arrows and taking trophies. This was the custom of the Plains War. To mutilate the enemy was to ensure they could not fight in the afterlife, or to mark them as cowards. Ears were severed, fingers chopped off to retrieve rings, and limbs hacked apart. The grass was slippery with gore. Sitting Bull rode past the carnage, his face impassive. He saw a young warrior holding a carbine, shaking it at the sky. He saw a woman driving an awl into the ears of a corpse, shouting that he should hear better in the next life. Sitting Bull stopped near the body of a soldier who had fought bravely. He looked down at the pale, lifeless face. He felt a deep sadness amidst the triumph. He knew that this victory, while absolute, was the beginning of a different kind of end. "They will never forgive us for this," he said to a sub-chief riding beside him. "We have killed their great father's favorite son. Now they will hunt us like wolves." He ordered the warriors to stop the mutilation of Custer's body, though some say it was because Custer had cut his hair short before the campaign and was not recognized, or because of a pact of brotherhood Custer had allegedly made with the Cheyenne years prior. Whatever the reason, Custer lay relatively untouched, stripped naked but for his socks, looking like he was asleep in the center of the slaughter. The camp did not rest that night. The victory celebration was manic, fueled by adrenaline and relief. Great bonfires were lit, illuminating the valley. The drums beat a rhythm that mimicked the heartbeat of the earth. Warriors danced, reenacting their kills, holding up captured carbines and bloody tunics. But Sitting Bull did not dance. He sat in the council lodge, smoking his pipe, his eyes dark. He was thinking of the logistics of survival. The stench of the dead bodies on the ridge would soon become unbearable in the summer heat. The grass in the valley was trampled and eaten. They had to move. Furthermore, the soldiers Reno had commanded were still dug in on the bluffs to the south. The warriors kept them pinned down throughout the night and the next day, firing into their entrenchments, denying them water. The thirst of the wounded soldiers on the hill was a torture that the Sioux could hear in their cries for water, water, drifting down the wind. Sitting Bull allowed the siege to continue, but he knew they could not stay indefinitely. His scouts reported that another column, the one led by General Terry and Colonel Gibbon, was approaching from the north. The walking soldiers with the big guns were coming. On the evening of June 26th, Sitting Bull made the decision. "We have killed enough," he told the council. "Let the others go. We must save the meat." He ordered the camp to strike the lodges. The mobilization was a testament to the discipline of the tribe. In less than an hour, the immense city of Tipis was dismantled. The lodge poles were lashed to the horses, the travois loaded with the wounded and the plunder. The grass where the camp had stood was beaten flat, stained with the blood of the butcher sites and the debris of war. The procession that moved out of the valley was massive. It moved south toward the Bighorn Mountains, a dark, undulating snake of people and animals. Sitting Bull rode at the rear, guarding the retreat. He looked back at the ridges where the bodies of over 260 soldiers lay rotting in the sun. The smoke from the grass fires set by the warriors to mask their movement drifted across the battlefield, a gray shroud for the dead. The Battle of the Greasy Grass was the zenith of the Sioux power. It was the moment when the vision of the inverted soldiers became a terrifying reality. But as Sitting Bull rode into the darkness of the Bighorn Mountains, he carried the heavy knowledge that this was a singular event, a lightning strike that could not be repeated. The ammunition captured would not last forever. The soldiers would come back, and next time, there would be thousands of them. The United States would not accept this humiliation. They would pour the resources of an entire industrial nation into the destruction of the man who had inspired it. Sitting Bull had won the battle, but in doing so, he had guaranteed a war of extinction. The Greasy Grass was not a new beginning. It was the violent, bloody crescendo before the long silence of the end. On the humid morning of July 10th in the year 1876, the great coalition that had shattered the 7th Cavalry began to fracture under the weight of its own victory. Sitting Bull stood on the edge of the camp, watching as the lodge poles were dragged through the dust, carving lines into the earth that pointed in a dozen different directions. The vast herd of humanity which had consumed the resources of the valley in days could no longer sustain itself as a single body. The grass was eaten down to the roots, and the game had fled the stench of death that drifted from the Greasy Grass battlefield. The separation was a strategic necessity, yet it felt like the dismemberment of a giant beast. The Oglala under Crazy Horse turned toward the Bighorn Mountains while the Cheyennes moved south. Sitting Bull, gathering the Hunkpapa and the die-hard traditionalists, turned his face toward the north and east, aiming for the Yellowstone River, knowing that the retaliation from the United States would be swift, mechanical, and merciless. The summer and autumn of 1876 dissolved into a running fight against a Hydra-headed enemy. The United States Army poured fresh troops into the territory, men who arrived by steamboat and railroad carrying winter gear and heavy artillery. General Alfred Terry and General George Crook swept the plains with columns so large they darkened the prairie. They did not try to find the Indians in a fair fight. They sought to grind them down through constant pursuit. Sitting Bull kept his people moving, traversing the rugged badlands where the wagons of the soldiers could not follow. They slept in their clothes, weapons always within reach, horses saddled. There were no victory dances now, only the grim silence of the hunted. The smoke of the cooking fires was kept low, and the scouts watched the back trail with eyes stinging from lack of sleep. In September, the government enacted the sell or starve policy, officially seizing the Black Hills and demanding that all Sioux surrender their arms and ponies or face total cutoff of rations at the agencies. While the reservation Indians capitulated, signing away the sacred hills under duress, Sitting Bull remained in the unceded territory, an outlaw in his own land. He watched from the high buttes as the soldiers attacked the camp of American Horse at Slim Buttes. He saw the smoke rising and knew another band had been broken. He led a counterattack to help the survivors, riding down the bluffs to fire into the soldier lines, but the infantry held the high ground with long-range rifles. The Hunkpapa were forced to withdraw, leaving the bodies of women and children in the ravines, a testament to the new reality of total war. By October of 1876, a new adversary emerged, who would dog Sitting Bull's steps with the persistence of a wolf. Colonel Nelson Miles, known to the Lakota as Bear's Coat because of the fur-trimmed coat he wore, established a cantonment at the mouth of the Tongue River. Miles was not like Custer. He was methodical, cold, and willing to campaign through the deepest snows of winter. In late October, sitting atop a ridge, Sitting Bull sent a note to Miles written by a half-breed captive. The note was a mixture of defiance and a plea for the soldiers to leave. "I want to know what you are doing on this road," it read. "You scare all the buffalo away. I want to hunt in this place. I want you to turn back from here." Miles responded by arranging a parley between the lines. On a windy day, amidst the golden grass of autumn, the two leaders met. Sitting Bull wore a buffalo robe and carried a carbine. Miles was surrounded by a heavy guard. The air crackled with hostility. Sitting Bull spoke plainly, stating that the Great Spirit had made him an Indian and not an agency Indian. He demanded that the soldiers leave the country and destroy their forts. Miles, arrogant and unyielding, demanded unconditional surrender. The talk quickly degenerated. Sitting Bull saw the soldiers shifting their grips on their rifles. He signaled his warriors, who were hiding in the coulees. The meeting ended without a handshake. As Sitting Bull rode away, the artillery began to fire. The shells screamed overhead, bursting with concussive force that threw dirt and shrapnel into the ranks of the retreating Hunkpapa. The winter of 1876 to 1877 was a crucible of misery. The snow fell early and stayed late, piling into drifts 10 feet deep. Miles did not stop. He outfitted his infantry in buffalo coats and marched them into the teeth of the blizzards. He used his artillery to shell the camps from miles away, forcing the families to flee into the night, abandoning their lodges and meat. Sitting Bull saw the toll it was taking. The horses were dying of starvation, stripping the bark from the cottonwood trees. The children were crying from the cold, their skin turning gray and cracked. The warriors were exhausted, their ammunition pouches light. They were fighting a ghost. Every time they stopped to rest, the blue column would appear on the horizon, relentless as the winter wind. In the spring of 1877, the decision was made. The United States was no longer a home. It was a slaughterhouse. Sitting Bull looked north toward the grandmother's country, the land ruled by Queen Victoria. He had heard that the redcoats there were just that they did not kill Indians for sport, and that the buffalo still roamed in safety. It was a bitter pill to leave the land of his ancestors, the ground where his umbilical cord was buried, but the alternative was extermination. In May of 1877, the Hunkpapa broke camp and began the long trek to the border. They crossed the boundary line, known to them as the Medicine Line, near the Wood Mountain area. It was an invisible border marked only by piles of stones and the distinct absence of pursuing bluecoats. As the rear guard crossed over, they stopped and waited. The United States troops pulled up short, halted by the international boundary. Sitting Bull watched them from the Canadian side. He saw the frustration in their posture. For the first time in a year, the guns were silent. The people dismounted, falling to their knees to kiss the earth of this new sanctuary. They were exiles, but they were alive. The reception in Canada was cautious but correct. Major James Walsh of the Northwest Mounted Police rode out to meet the influx of thousands of Sioux. Walsh was a man of stern countenance but clear eyes. He rode into Sitting Bull's camp with only a handful of men, a display of courage that earned the chief's immediate respect. Walsh explained the law of the Great White Mother. They could stay, they could hunt, and they would be protected, but they could not use Canada as a base to raid the United States, and they must obey the Queen's laws. Sitting Bull shook Walsh's hand. "We will bury our weapons," he said. "We have come here for peace. We are tired of war." Life in the grandmother's country was initially a respite. The Hunkpapa set up their lodges in the White Mud River Valley. The buffalo were still plentiful in the Cypress Hills, and for a season the old life seemed to return. The drying racks were heavy with meat. The women engaged in quill work without the fear of a dawn attack. Sitting Bull and Major Walsh developed a complex friendship. They spent hours talking in Walsh's quarters. Sitting Bull told him of the broken treaties, the lies of the commissioners, and the gold thieves. Walsh listened, documenting the grievances, understanding that this man was not a savage but a patriot fighting for a doomed sovereignty. However, the sanctuary was fragile. The Canadian government was alarmed by the presence of 5,000 foreign Indians. The local tribes, the Cree and the Blackfoot, were traditional enemies of the Sioux, and tensions over hunting grounds began to simmer. The food supply was finite. The buffalo herds, which had once covered the earth like a brown carpet, were thinning. The United States, seeking to force the Sioux back south, began to set fires along the border to burn the grass, preventing the herds from migrating north. This ecological warfare struck at the stomach of the exile community. In October of 1877, the United States made a formal attempt to retrieve their most famous fugitive. A commission led by General Terry, the man who had organized the campaign of 1876, traveled to Fort Walsh to negotiate. Sitting Bull entered the meeting room with a dignity that silenced the officers. He wore a wolfskin cap and a blanket wrapped tight around his shoulders. When Terry offered a pardon in exchange for surrender and a return to the reservation, Sitting Bull's eyes flashed with a cold fire. He refused to shake Terry's hand. He stood and delivered a scathing rebuke. "You come here to tell us lies," he said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You are the people who killed my women and children. You are the people who stole my land. Why should I believe you now? I am safe here. I can sleep here. I will not go back." He turned his back on the general and walked out, leaving the Americans humiliated and empty-handed. The rejection of the Terry Commission hardened the resolve of the authorities on both sides of the border. The Canadian government, pressured by Washington and eager to settle their own western territories, began to withhold support. They refused to issue reservations or annuities to the Sioux. "You are American Indians," the officials said. "Go to your own country for food." Major Walsh, sympathetic to Sitting Bull, was transferred away to break the bond between them. Sitting Bull found himself isolated, facing a new enemy that no amount of bravery could defeat: famine. By 1880, the situation had become desperate. The buffalo were gone, exterminated by commercial hunters. The camp at Wood Mountain was a place of ghosts. The horses, once the pride of the Hunkpapa, were slaughtered for food. Then the dogs were eaten. Finally, the people began to boil the leather of their parfleches and the soles of their old moccasins to extract a thin, gluey broth. Sickness followed the hunger. Children with distended bellies and stick-like limbs lay listless in the lodges. The coughing sickness took the elders. Sitting Bull walked among his people, giving away his last scraps of food, but he had nothing left to give. He saw the accusation in the eyes of the mothers. His stubbornness, once their shield, was now their starvation. The unity of the camp began to fracture. Sub-chiefs, watching their families die, began to slip away. Gall, the iron-willed war chief who had fought so fiercely at the Little Bighorn, argued with Sitting Bull. "We cannot eat pride," Gall said. "The Americans have beef. Here we have only snow." In late 1880 and early 1881, Gall led a large group of Hunkpapa back across the line to surrender. Crow King followed. Sitting Bull was left with a dwindling band of fewer than 200 loyalists, the old ones who preferred death to submission. But even he could not watch his own children perish. His daughter, Many Horses, was weak and fading. His young son, Crow Foot, cried from the hunger pains. The winter of 1881 was the final straw. The cold was so intense that the trees exploded. There was absolutely no game. The Canadian traders refused to advance any more credit. Sitting Bull sat in his lodge, wrapped in a threadbare blanket, staring at the empty pot. He realized that the war was over. It had not been lost on the battlefield. It had been lost in the empty stomach of a child. He called the remaining council together. "It is finished," he said, his voice heavy with a crushing fatigue. I will not let you die here. We will go back. We will go to the white man's cage. The journey south in July of 1881 was a funeral procession for a way of life. The group moved slowly, their horses skeletal, their clothes in rags. They crossed the border without fanfare. There were no armies waiting to fight them, only the vast empty silence of the plains that had been stripped of the buffalo. They headed toward Fort Buford in the Dakota Territory. Sitting Bull rode at the front, his head high, but his heart was ash. He was riding into the belly of the beast he had fought all his life. On the 19th day of July, 1881, the column arrived at Fort Buford. Major David Brotherton waited to receive the surrender. The fort was a bustle of activity, soldiers and civilians eager to see the monster who had killed Custer. Sitting Bull dismounted. He looked small, his face lined with deep crevices of worry and exposure, wearing a calico shirt and a pair of smoke-stained leggings. He did not hand his rifle directly to the major. That would be an act of submission too great to bear personally. Instead, he called his 8-year-old son, Crow Foot, to his side. Sitting Bull handed his Winchester carbine, the weapon that had defended the people for years, to the boy. Then he instructed the boy to hand the gun to Major Brotherton. I surrender this rifle to you through my young son, Sitting Bull said, his voice carrying clearly in the dry air. I wish him to learn the ways of the whites, for he will grow up in their world. I wish it to be known that I was the last man of my tribe to surrender my rifle. The act was symbolic and devastating. By passing the gun through his son, he was acknowledging that the fighting days were over for his generation, and that the burden of survival in the white world now fell to the children. He also handed over his ponies, the currency of his culture. He was stripped of his power, his mobility, and his weapons. He was now a prisoner of war. After the surrender, the soldiers issued rations, fresh beef, flour, and coffee. The starving Hunkpapa ate with a voracious intensity, the grease running down their chins. Sitting Bull ate slowly, tasting the bitterness of the charity. He looked around the fort at the square buildings, the flags snapping in the wind, the fences. This was his future. The open plains, the thundering herds, the freedom of the grandma's country. It was all gone. He was 50 years old and he had outlived his world. He was placed on a steamboat, the General Sherman, to be transported downriver. As the boat churned away from the dock, moving down the muddy Missouri, Sitting Bull stood on the deck, watching the banks slide by. He saw the ruts of the wagon roads, the telegraph poles, the wood yards. The spider had spun its web across the entire land. He had fought it with the slash of the knife and the vision of the spirit, but the web was made of iron and hunger. He was heading toward the Standing Rock Agency, toward a life of confinement. But his spirit remained unbowed. He had surrendered his gun, but he had not surrendered his soul. The exile in the grandma's country had ended, and the captivity of the reservation had begun. In the month of September in the year 1881, Sitting Bull was transferred from Fort Yates to Fort Randall, a military outpost situated further down the Missouri River. His status was strictly defined as a prisoner of war. The journey took place aboard the steamboat W.J. Bean, surrounded by heavily armed soldiers holding their rifles at the ready. Sitting Bull sat on the open deck wrapped in a blanket, his dark eyes taking in the passing landscape of the Dakota Territory. The riverbanks, once teeming with elk and free-roaming buffalo, were now dotted with the geometric scars of white settlement. Rectangular wooden cabins crisscrossing split-rail fences and grazing cattle that moved sluggishly compared to the wild beasts of his youth. The confinement at Fort Randall marked the end of his physical mobility and the beginning of a relentless psychological war. The conditions at Fort Randall were austere and degrading. He was housed in a wall tent within the post limits, guarded 24 hours a day by armed sentries. The warrior who had traversed the vast plains at will was now restricted to a small patch of trampled earth. Idleness became a heavy weight. His muscles, accustomed to the rigors of the hunt and the battlefield, began to soften. The food provided was standard army issue, salted pork that tasted of brine and hardtack biscuits that required soaking in water to become edible. This diet sat heavy in his stomach, a poor substitute for the fresh bison meat that had sustained the hunkpapa for generations. Isolation was compounded by the constant intrusion of the white gaze. Fort Randall became a destination for journalists, curious civilians, and military officers who wanted to stare at the man blamed for the annihilation of the 7th Cavalry. Sitting Bull was subjected to endless questions through interpreters. He was treated like a captured apex predator, an exhibit to be examined for signs of savagery. He responded with a stoic dignity that often frustrated his interrogators. He refused to show remorse for the Battle of the Little Bighorn, stating calmly that the soldiers had invaded his home and he had defended his families. His composure under this scrutiny earned him a grudging respect from the fort commander, Colonel George Andrews, who allowed Sitting Bull to tend a small garden of corn and melons outside his tent to pass the time. In May of the year 1883, the United States government determined that Sitting Bull was no longer a military threat and authorized his release from Fort Randall. He was transported north to the Standing Rock Agency, the reservation designated for his people. The landscape of Standing Rock was a bleak expanse of prairie bisected by the Grand River. Here, the great chief came face to face with the ultimate instrument of his oppression: Indian agent James McLaughlin. McLaughlin, known to the Lakota as Whitehair, was a rigid, authoritarian bureaucrat absolutely committed to the total assimilation of the Indians. He believed the old ways were sinful, and that the only path to survival for the Sioux was to become Christian farmers who obeyed the commands of the United States. The arrival of Sitting Bull at Standing Rock created an immediate power struggle. The Hunkpapa people, battered and starving, looked to Sitting Bull for guidance. They gathered around his cabin, seeking his counsel. McLaughlin saw this influence as a direct challenge to his authority. He implemented a policy to systematically break Sitting Bull's power. He bypassed the chief in all official matters, dealing instead with minor leaders who were willing to comply with agency directives in exchange for extra rations or favored status. Sitting Bull was ordered to take up the hoe and plow the hard, unyielding earth. He complied partially, recognizing the necessity of food, but he refused to accept the spiritual degradation of the act, performing the labor with a visible contempt for the process. McLaughlin utilized food as his primary weapon. Rations were distributed from the agency storehouse, and the agent controlled the ledger. When Sitting Bull organized dances or gatherings to maintain the traditions of the people, McLaughlin would threaten to cut off the meat and flour supplies. The threat of hunger was absolute. Sitting Bull watched the children of his camp growing thin, their ribs showing through their skin. He was forced into a bitter compromise, attending the agency roll calls and enduring the lectures from the agent. The warrior who had defied cannons was now engaged in a war of paperwork, permits, and ration tickets, a conflict fought across the dusty floors of the agency office. In the year 1885, a bizarre escape from the reservation monotony presented itself. William F. Cody, widely known as Buffalo Bill, requested permission to hire Sitting Bull for his Wild West show. Cody was a master showman who understood the immense commercial value of the Custer killer. McLaughlin surprisingly supported the idea. The agent believed that traveling to the eastern cities and witnessing the overwhelming population and industrial power of the white civilization would finally crush Sitting Bull's resistance. A contract was drawn up, paying the chief $50 a week, a staggering sum at the time, along with exclusive rights to sell his autograph and photographs. Sitting Bull boarded a train heading east in June of 1885. The locomotive was a terrifying beast of iron and steam, belching black smoke as it carried him away from the plains. As the train moved through the Midwest and into the great eastern metropolises, Sitting Bull pressed his face against the glass. The sheer scale of the white world was a shock. The cities were canyons of brick and stone, the streets choked with horse-drawn traffic, the air thick with the smell of coal, unwashed bodies, and factory exhaust. The noise was constant, a mechanical roar that assaulted the senses. He realized the futility of the military resistance. The whites were as numerous as the blades of grass on the prairie. The Wild West show was a grand spectacle of historical revisionism. It featured mock stagecoach robberies, trick shooting, and reenactments of famous battles. Sitting Bull's role was minimal but pivotal. He did not participate in the mock battles. He simply rode into the arena on horseback, dressed in his full regalia, wearing the magnificent eagle feather war bonnet. The master of ceremonies would announce his name, and the reaction was explosive. In some cities, the crowds erupted in boos, hisses, and insults, seeing the man who had ordered the slaughter of American heroes. In others, particularly in Canada, he was greeted with thunderous applause and respect. Sitting Bull endured the public display with an impassive face. He did not wave or smile. He simply sat his horse and looked out at the thousands of faces in the stands. The lights of the arena blinded him, and the smell of the popcorn and roasted peanuts mixed with the dust kicked up by the horses. Behind the scenes, Cody treated Sitting Bull with immense respect. He provided the chief with a comfortable tent and ensured the performers did not harass him. Sitting Bull reciprocated this respect, viewing Cody as a truthful man who kept his financial promises, a rare quality among the whites he had encountered. During the tour, Sitting Bull developed a close friendship with the show's star shooter, Annie Oakley. He was fascinated by her incredible accuracy with a rifle, a skill that commanded the utmost respect in Sioux culture. He adopted her as his daughter, bestowing upon her the name Little Sure Shot. They communicated through sign language and interpreters. Oakley recognized the profound sadness within the old chief and treated him with a gentle kindness that transcended the carnival atmosphere of the show. She provided a human connection in a world that viewed him primarily as a monster or a curiosity. While touring cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia, Sitting Bull witnessed the dark underbelly of the industrial boom. As he walked the streets accompanied by his handlers, he was swarmed by ragged, homeless children begging for food. The poverty of the white slums shocked him deeply. He could not comprehend a society that possessed such immense wealth and technological power, yet allowed its own children to starve in the gutters. He reached into his pockets and gave away nearly all of the silver dollars he earned from his autograph sales to these urchins. He saw no difference between these white children and the starving orphans of the Hunkpapa. The tour concluded at the end of the year 1885. Cody offered Sitting Bull a contract for the following season, including a tour across the ocean to Europe. Sitting Bull declined. He was homesick for the quiet of the Grand River, the smell of the sagebrush, and the sound of his native language. As a parting gift, Cody presented Sitting Bull with a beautiful gray horse, a trained circus animal that could perform tricks at the sound of a gunshot, and a large white sombrero. Sitting Bull accepted the gifts with deep gratitude and boarded the train back to the Dakota Territory. His return to Standing Rock in late 1885 was not a surrender to assimilation as McLaughlin had hoped. The experience in the East had confirmed his belief that the white way of life was fundamentally flawed. He saw a society driven by greed, where the strong ignored the weak. He returned to his gray log cabin on the Grand River with a renewed determination to protect the spiritual integrity of his people. He hung his Winchester carbine on the wall, no longer a weapon of war but a symbol of the past, and focused his energy on the political defense of the remaining land. The gray horse from Cody became Sitting Bull's constant companion. The animal was a local curiosity on the reservation. Sitting Bull would ride the horse to the agency wearing the white sombrero, presenting a striking figure that commanded attention. He used his accumulated wealth from the tour to support his extended family, purchasing cattle and horses to build a herd. He tried to set an example of self-sufficiency, raising crops and stock, but he refused to cut his hair, wear white men's trousers, or attend the Christian church services mandated by the agency. Agent McLaughlin's frustration reached new heights. He increased the pressure, sending the agency police, a force made up of Lakota men who had chosen the path of assimilation, to harass Sitting Bull. These police, known as the Metal Breasts because of their badges, viewed Sitting Bull as an obstacle to their own advancement. They monitored his visitors, searched his cabin for contraband, and reported his every move to the agent. Sitting Bull treated the police with open contempt, calling them dogs who did the bidding of the white masters against their own blood. This internal division created a toxic atmosphere on the reservation, turning brother against brother. In the year 1887, the United States Congress passed the Dawes Act, a policy designed to dissolve the reservations entirely. The act proposed to divide the communal tribal lands into individual allotments for each family head, with the vast remaining surplus land to be sold to white homesteaders. For the Sioux, this meant the dismemberment of the Great Sioux Reservation. It was the final phase of the land theft, accomplished not with soldiers but with surveyors and legislation. Sitting Bull recognized the mortal danger of this act. The concept of individual land ownership was alien and repulsive to the Lakota worldview. The earth could not be cut into pieces and owned. When the government sent a commission in the year 1888 to secure the signatures needed for the land cession, Sitting Bull mobilized the opposition. He traveled from camp to camp along the Grand River, speaking to the men in the council lodges. His voice, though older and rougher, still carried the power of Sitting Bull. He urged the people not to touch the pen. He reminded them of the lies of the past, the stolen Black Hills and the starvation that always followed the signing of papers. His influence held. The Commission of 1888 failed to get the required 3/4 majority of adult male signatures, a humiliating defeat for McLaughlin and the authorities in Washington. The government, however, was relentless. In the summer of the year 1889, they sent a new commission, this one headed by General George Crook, the very man who had fought Sitting Bull at the Battle of the Rosebud. Crook understood the stakes and the psychology of the Sioux. He brought the full weight of the United States government to bear. The commission arrived with threats. They told the people that if they did not sign, the land would be taken by force anyway, and their rations would be cut off entirely. The specter of starvation was raised once again. The Great Council to decide the fate of the land was held at the Standing Rock Agency in July of 1889. Thousands of Sioux gathered. The heat was oppressive, the dust thick in the air. Sitting Bull arrived with a strong contingent of loyalists, determined to block the sale. But McLaughlin had prepared the ground. He had bribed the agency chiefs with promises of favored treatment and intimidated the wavering ones with threats. He isolated Sitting Bull, keeping him out of the main negotiation tent until the crucial moments. When Sitting Bull finally pushed his way through the crowd to speak, the atmosphere was volatile. He stood before the commissioners, his eyes blazing. He pointed his finger at Crook. He accused the general and the government of acting like thieves in the night. He appealed to the pride of the warriors, asking if they were women to be scared by the white man's words. But the fear of starvation was too strong. One by one, the agency chiefs stepped forward and touched the pen. Sitting Bull watched as the future of the nation was signed away. The Great Sioux Reservation was fractured into 5 smaller, isolated islands of land, separated by millions of acres of open territory now available for white settlement. Sitting Bull left the agency in a state of profound grief. He rode back to his cabin on the Grand River, the sound of the signing ringing in his ears. The defeat of 1889 was a spiritual blow heavier than any military loss. He had held the line with the gun, he had held the line with diplomacy in Canada, and he had tried to hold the line with political resistance. But the relentless, crushing weight of the white expansion could not be stopped. He was a prisoner not just of the reservation, but of an era that had passed him by. Back at his cabin, the routine of survival continued. The rations provided by the government were reduced again, a cruel punishment for the resistance. The winter of 1889 approached with a bleak certainty. Disease began to spread through the poorly nourished camps. Influenza and whooping cough claimed the lives of the young and the old. Sitting Bull tended to his sick children using traditional herbal medicines that seemed powerless against the white man's sickness. The despair on the reservation was total. The people had given up their land, their guns, and their way of life, and in return they received sickness and hunger. Sitting Bull often sat outside his cabin in the evenings, watching the sun set over the bluffs of the Grand River. He was 58 years old. His body carried the scars of countless battles, the bullet wound in his foot, the self-inflicted cuts from the sun dance. He felt a deep connection to the earth beneath him, the soil where his ancestors were buried. He knew that the white men would eventually come for the last of it. He had no illusions left. Word reached the cabin of a new movement starting in the West among the Paiute people. It was a story of a Messiah, an Indian Christ named Wovoka, who promised that a new world was coming. This new world would see the disappearance of the white man, the return of the buffalo, and the resurrection of the dead ancestors. It required a special dance to bring this vision to reality. The rumors of this ghost dance drifted across the plains like the scent of rain after a long drought. Desperate people grasped at desperate hopes. Agent McLaughlin watched Sitting Bull's cabin closely. The agent knew that any spark of rebellion would find its home with the old chief. McLaughlin placed Sitting Bull under near-constant surveillance. The metal-breasted police camped near his property, noting who came and went. Sitting Bull ignored them. He was a prisoner, yes, but inside his mind he was still the same, unbroken chief. He refused to let the agent dictate his beliefs. As the year 1889 drew to a close, the stage was set for the final tragedy. The showman's prisoner, the man who had seen the great cities and rejected them, sat by his fire and waited for the ghosts to dance. In the autumn of the year 1890, a feverish energy began to pulse through the Standing Rock Agency, traversing the frozen ground like an electrical current. It started with a whisper from the west, carried by Kicking Bear, a Minneconjou delegate who had traveled beyond the shining mountains to the Paiute country in Nevada. He brought news of a Messiah named Wovoka, a man who had died and returned to life with a message from the Great Spirit. The message was a potent elixir for a people drowning in despair. Wovoka promised that if the Indians lived cleanly, stopped fighting, and performed a specific round dance for 5 successive days, the earth would be renewed. A new layer of soil would cover the white man's world, burying the fences, the railroads, and the starving settlements. The buffalo would return in thundering herds, and the ancestors who had died from disease and war would rise again to embrace the living. Sitting Bull listened to Kicking Bear's report in the privacy of his cabin on the Grand River. The old chief was skeptical of the claim that the white men would simply vanish, for he had seen their stone cities and their endless numbers. Yet he saw the light returning to the eyes of his people. The hunk papa were starving. The government had cut the beef rations again, reducing the allowance to a level that guaranteed malnutrition. The children were dying of whooping cough and measles. If this dance could offer even a sliver of hope, he would not stand in its way. He gave Kicking Bear permission to instruct the people. He did not fully embrace the doctrine himself, but he allowed his camp to become the epicenter of the movement on the reservation. The dancing began in October. It was unlike the war dances of the past. Men and women joined hands in a great circle, their fingers interlaced, moving slowly to the left with a rhythmic shuffling step. They did not use drums. They sang songs of longing and resurrection, their voices rising in a haunting, discordant wail that drifted across the prairie. As the intensity of the dance increased, participants would fall into trances, collapsing onto the hard earth. In these states, they twitched and moaned, visiting the spirit world where they saw green grass and fat buffalo. When they awoke, they told stories of meeting their dead mothers and fathers. They began to wear ghost shirts, muslin garments painted with eagles, buffalo, and sacred symbols, which the priests claimed were impervious to the soldiers' bullets and the police clubs. Agent James McLaughlin watched the spread of the ghost dance with a growing paranoia. To his bureaucratic mind, the dance was not a religious revival but a prelude to an uprising. He saw the large gatherings, the cessation of farm work, and the renewed defiance in the eyes of the warriors, and he panicked. He sent frantic telegrams to Washington, describing the dance as a war of extermination being planned by the Sioux. He focused his fear entirely on Sitting Bull. Although the dance had originated elsewhere, McLaughlin was convinced that Sitting Bull was the mastermind, the high priest manipulating the superstition to reassert his old authority. The agent believed that if he could remove the head of the snake, the body would wither. The tension escalated in November. The United States Army, reacting to the hysteria of the agents, mobilized troops to the reservations. This deployment terrified the dancers, who interpreted the arrival of the soldiers as the beginning of a massacre. Thousands of Brule and Oglala fled their agencies to the remote stronghold of the Badlands, but Sitting Bull remained at his camp on the Grand River. He continued to host the dances, ignoring McLaughlin's orders to stop. When the agent sent a message demanding he come to the agency to explain himself, Sitting Bull declined, stating he was too busy with the spiritual needs of his people. It was a rejection of white authority that McLaughlin could not tolerate. In mid-November, the military commander in the region, General Nelson Miles, sought to defuse the situation by sending a friend to bring the old chief in. He dispatched William F. Cody, Buffalo Bill, who traveled to Standing Rock with a wagon full of gifts. Cody intended to visit Sitting Bull, talk to him as an old friend, and persuade him to come in peacefully. McLaughlin, jealous of his jurisdiction and fearing that Cody's interference would undermine his control, orchestrated a deception. He sent a bogus telegram to Cody claiming that Sitting Bull had already fled to the Badlands, and he sent spies to tell Cody that the Hunkpapa were waiting in ambush to kill him. Cody, confused and thwarted, turned back. The last chance for a peaceful resolution evaporated on the frozen road. By December, the atmosphere at Standing Rock was toxic. The reservation was divided into two hostile camps, the hostiles who danced and the progressives who sided with the government. McLaughlin decided that he could not wait for the military to act. He obtained an order for Sitting Bull's arrest. He planned to use the Indian police, the Metal Breasts, to carry out the raid. It was a calculated move to prevent a clash between white soldiers and Indians, but it ensured that the violence would be fratricidal. He selected Lieutenant Henry Bull Head, a man known for his rigid discipline and personal dislike of Sitting Bull, to lead the detachment. Sergeant Shavehead would be his second. The force consisted of over 40 heavily armed policemen, men who were cousins and neighbors of the people they were sent to arrest. On the 14th day of December 1890, the weather turned bitter. A gray ceiling of clouds lowered over the plains and the temperature dropped. McLaughlin received word that Sitting Bull was preparing to leave the reservation to join the dancers at Pine Ridge. This was the excuse he needed. He issued the order to Bullhead. You must make the arrest before daylight tomorrow morning. Do not let him escape." The police gathered at the Oak Creek station, checking their Winchester repeating rifles and Navy revolvers. They were nervous. They knew they were going to confront the most famous Indian living, a man who possessed strong medicine and a loyal following. They drank strong coffee and waited for the night to deepen. In the pre-dawn darkness of December 15th, the police column moved out. The hooves of their horses were muffled by the soft dirt and the rising wind. They arrived at the settlement on the Grand River just as the first hint of gray light touched the eastern horizon. The camp was asleep. Smoke curled lazily from the chimneys of the log cabins. The police dismounted silently and surrounded Sitting Bull's cabin. Bullhead, Shavehead, and a policeman named Red Tomahawk approached the door. They did not knock. They pushed the door open and strode into the single room. Inside, the air was warm and smelled of wood smoke and sleeping bodies. Sitting Bull was asleep on a bed made of blankets on the floor. His wives, Catch the Bear and Seen by Her Nation, were sleeping nearby. Bullhead struck a match, the sudden flare of light waking the occupants. Sitting Bull sat up, blinking, confused by the intrusion. "You are under arrest," Bullhead announced, his voice tight. "You must come to the agency." Sitting Bull looked at the men, recognizing them. He did not reach for the weapons hanging on the wall. He nodded slowly. "All right," he said. "Let me put on my clothes." The women began to wail, realizing what was happening. Sitting Bull stood and began to dress. He pulled on his leggings and a calico shirt. He asked one of his wives to get his best coat. The police were impatient, jostling him, urging him to hurry. "Do not pull me," Sitting Bull said, pulling his arm away. "I am coming." The commotion inside the cabin grew louder. Outside, the dogs began to bark. The noise woke the camp. Loyal warriors, the bodyguards who had sworn to protect the chief, grabbed their rifles and ran toward the cabin. They saw the police horses and the armed men surrounding the door. By the time the police pushed Sitting Bull out of the door, a crowd of over 100 Hunkpapa had gathered in the yard. The tension was palpable. The air was cold and sharp. Sitting Bull stood on the threshold, flanked by Bullhead on his right and Shavehead on his left. Red Tomahawk stood behind him with a revolver pressed against the back of his head. Sitting Bull looked at the crowd. He saw his son, 17-year-old Crow Foot, standing nearby. He saw his trusted warrior, Catch the Bear, a man who bore the same name as one of the wives, pushing through the front rank, a Winchester in his hands. The crowd began to shout at the police. "You shall not take him," someone yelled. "Let him go." The police tried to push through the mob, but the press of bodies was too thick. Sitting Bull stopped, walking. He planted his feet. The humiliation of being dragged away by his own people in front of his women and warriors caused a sudden shift in his demeanor. He looked at Bullhead. "I am not going," he said loudly. "Do with me what you like. I am not going. Come on, take action." This declaration was the spark. Catch the Bear, seeing his chief resist, raised his rifle and fired point blank at Bullhead. The bullet struck the lieutenant in the side, tearing through his liver. The impact spun Bullhead around, but as he fell, his reflex was to fire his own weapon. He pulled the trigger of his revolver, which was pressed against Sitting Bull's side. The heavy slug entered the chief's chest between the 10th and 11th ribs and exited through the lower back. Simultaneously, Red Tomahawk, reacting to the gunshot, fired his revolver into the back of Sitting Bull's head. The bullet crashed into the skull, severing the spinal cord. Sitting Bull dropped instantly, collapsing into the frozen dirt without a sound. Shavehead was also struck in the initial volley, taking a bullet to the abdomen that dropped him beside the dying chief. The yard erupted into a chaotic, point-blank firefight. The police and the warriors were standing only feet apart. Gunsmoke filled the space between the cabins, obscuring the combatants in a gray fog. The gray circus horse, the gift from Buffalo Bill which had been tied near the cabin, heard the gunfire. In the midst of the slaughter, the animal began to perform its tricks. It sat down on its haunches and raised one hoof, thinking the shooting was the cue for its act. It sat there, a bizarre, surreal spectator performing for a master who was already dead, while men screamed and died around it. The police, though outnumbered, were better disciplined and held the doorway of the cabin. They fired volley after volley into the Hunkpapa loyalists. The warriors, devastated by the immediate loss of their leader, fought back with a desperate fury, but they were driven back to the timber along the river. The police retreated inside the cabin, dragging their wounded bullhead and shavehead with them. They barricaded the door and windows, firing through the chinking at anyone who moved in the yard. Inside the cabin, the scene was grim. The women had fled. The body of Sitting Bull lay outside, face down in the dirt, his blood melting a dark patch in the frost. But the killing was not over. Crowfoot, the young son who had handed over the rifle at Fort Buford, was hiding in the corner of the cabin, covered by a pile of blankets. The police, adrenaline pumping and enraged by the shooting of their leaders, heard a noise. They pulled back the blankets and found the boy. Crowfoot stood up, his hands empty. "My uncles," he pleaded, "and do not kill me. I do not wish to die." Bullhead, lying on the floor in agony, his life bleeding out, gave the order. "Do what you like with him. He is one of them who caused this trouble." The police raised their rifles. One man smashed the boy across the forehead with a gun butt, knocking him across the room. As he scrambled to rise, they shot him. Crowfoot fell dead, his body riddled with bullets, joining his father in the final silence. The siege of the cabin lasted until mid-morning. The Hunkpapa warriors kept the police pinned down, firing from the cover of the trees. It was only the arrival of the cavalry, 2 troops of the 8th Cavalry supported by Hotchkiss guns, that ended the fight. The soldiers fired shells into the timber, scattering the warriors. When the cavalry rode into the yard, they found a scene of carnage. The ground was littered with brass casings and bodies. The police, shaken and bloodied, emerged from the cabin. The soldiers took control of the site. They threw the body of Sitting Bull into a wagon, piling it on top of the other corpses like firewood. There was no ceremony, no mourning song. The wagon bounced over the frozen ruts of the road back to the agency. When they arrived at Fort Yates, the body was taken to the dead house. The soldiers and civilians crowded around to gawk at the fallen leader. One soldier smashed the face of the corpse with a piece of wood, a final act of desecration that an officer quickly stopped. Sitting Bull was buried on the 17th of December in the Omnipresent Cemetery at Fort Yates. The grave was dug in the corner of the yard, in soil that was hard as iron. They poured quicklime over the body before filling the hole, a measure intended to speed decomposition and prevent anyone from stealing the remains. There was no marker, just a patch of disturbed earth. The man who had united the Sioux Nation, who had wiped out Custer, and who had defied the United States for 40 years, was put into the ground in a wooden box made of rough lumber. The death of Sitting Bull sent a shockwave of terror through the remaining ghost dancers. Those who had been wavering now fled south to join the Bigfoot Band, believing that the soldiers were coming to kill them all. This mass flight set the stage for the final tragedy. 2 weeks later, on the 29th of December, the 7th Cavalry intercepted Bigfoot's band at Wounded Knee Creek. In the tension of the disarmament, a gun went off. The soldiers, fueled by vengeance and fear, opened fire with Hotchkiss guns on the camp. 300 men, women, and children were slaughtered in the snow, their bodies frozen into grotesque shapes by the blizzard that followed. But on that cold morning of December 15th, as the sun finally broke through the clouds over the Grand River, the silence that fell over the cabin was absolute. The gray horse, confused and abandoned, stood over the body of its master until the soldiers drove it away. The era of the horse warriors was finished. The ghost of the buffalo did not return. The new soil did not cover the white man's world. Instead, the white man's world had finally covered Sitting Bull. The vivid visions were gone, replaced by the dull reality of the fence and the plow. The Sitting Bull had led his warriors to the very end, and when the end came, it was not with a great battle cry on the open plain, but with a fratricidal bullet in the dark, leaving only the wind to tell the story of the man who sat like a stone bull against the tide of history.